Okay, so it's 1 o'clock. We have asked delegates to join early, so we can have a 1 o'clock start for our North East London Safeguarding Conference on Serious Violence. So welcome everyone. I'm sure there will be people coming in from lunch and so on, but I will kick start. First, I want to introduce myself. My name's Dr. Spina Firunji. I am a GP. I am the named GP for Child Safeguarding in Moreton Forest and Adult Safeguarding in Moreton Forest, Newham and Tower Hamlets. And I work for the ICB in North East London. I need to say a massive thank you to the Training Hub and to Joanna North, who's made this magic happen today and pulled it all together. So really big thank you to Training Hub for pulling this together and making it all possible. And I'd like to say a big thank you to all our speakers for agreeing to participate in this conference and attend, and to my colleagues at the ICB and the Safeguarding team for bringing forward ideas and supporting me in putting this together. So thank you very much. Joanna, do you want to bring up the ground? I think I can't remember if it's the ground rules slide. That's the one. Thank you. The housekeeping slide. So we are trying something new today. There will be time for Q&A that we've factored into each of the speakers' sessions. But what we'd like you to do is, well, we've got Slido, but later on, one of our presenters will be using Menti. So what we would like to do is either use the QR code or the number 18523 to submit your questions. The reason we're doing this is because it will allow the speakers to see the trends and themes of questions coming through, and also yourself as delegates, and try and answer them, because we hopefully will be having more numbers join us, and to get through everyone's questions is a tall order in the small time that we have, but we want to kind of get through the trend and theme. The session will be recorded. I kindly request you keep your mics on mute during the presentation. No issues with you keeping your cameras on. Often I think it's quite nice for a speaker to see some faces smiling back at them. And you will receive a certificate of attendance upon completion of your feedback form, which will be shared at the end of the session, and there'll be a QR code. There is a slight change to the agenda today. I think Joanna's going to bring up the next slide. Thank you. So our keynote speaker is Kenny Gibson, who I'm going to introduce shortly. But the change to the agenda is thank you to Dr. Josephine Emmanuel, who's coming in at the 11th hour, because one of our speakers had an unexpected, unforeseen circumstance and couldn't attend today. Also, we aren't having the second break because our last speaker has had to change things around due to unforeseen circumstances, but that will mean we finish earlier, and we do have a break halfway through the program. So I hope that doesn't cause too much disturbance in your day. So our break is at 2:15 to 2:25. We are covering tough subject matters. So if you do feel like you need to take some time out, or you have any questions later on, please feel free to email me or contact me, or reach out to any of the safeguarding team, and take 5 minutes and come back. I will hang on at the end if anyone does feel that they need to talk about anything or want to debrief about anything. We're always there, because these are quite tough subject matters. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Kenny Gibson, MBE, registered nurse and Queen's nurse. I believe you're still Deputy Director of NHS for Safeguarding. Got that correct. And now there we go. So congratulations. So thank you very much, Kenny, for coming on. I'm going to be quiet now and let you take it away.
Marvellous. I'm humbled at the invite of coming to listen to the rest of this session, this level 3 session. As we all know, level 3 is about listening, bearing witness, or believing what we're chatting about, the veracity of it, the effectiveness of it, but also doing something afterwards with it. And it will be really helpful to understand if I, as the National Head of Safeguarding, can support you. What does the national team do? Further up in the chat, there's all our apps and our resources that will supplement what we're about to learn from. And it is really important we move on to our subject matter experts, the clinicians that we can learn from excellence from, and particularly the lived experience, absolutely critical. And thank you for calling out a welfare check, because these things are difficult listens. In a team of 100 plus, there will be some of us who are impacted by serious violence. So the legislation is quite clear. The serious violence places a duty on integrated care boards to collaborate. It can be as simple or as complicated as that. And part of what I need to bring to witness for you is how can we do that? How can we support the designates and the data people at integrated care boards, the directors and the chief nurse at integrated care boards, and the name GPs and GPs in the primary care networks, but also organisations such as local maternity systems. Because the one thing I hear from my colleagues in North East London, and do believe me when I say you're not slow at coming forward with your local practitioner intelligence, it's really helpful, is there's an awful lot of excellence in practice in North East London. So let's shine a light on excellence within the system of trauma-informed serious violence. Absolutely, the lived experience and the local practitioner intelligence would tell us there is a growing and increasing concern around serious violence, regardless of what the legislation calls it. So it now includes domestic abuse, it includes violence against women and girls, it includes non-fatal strangulation. It does not depend on the legal definitions in my eyes as a nurse, as a practitioner, and as a citizen. It's about the voice of lived experience. It's how they relate to it. And so it's very important that we understand that serious violence is not only happening in families, it's certainly not only happening in homes, it's happening within communities, it's happening within education, it's happening within social settings, and almost certainly it is happening online as well. And so we must, as clinicians, be vigilant, and we must be bold and brave and courageous around certain things. Those certain things are what I want to focus on in terms of a call to action. Let's talk about being bold around data sharing. There is absolutely no legislation at all that inhibits you as a clinician practitioner from sharing data if it will protect a citizen from violence or death. Indeed, many of our regulations and a lot of our professional practice from the GMC, the NMC, the Royal Colleges actively supports us in legislation from sharing securely a required and reasonable amount of data, because, colleagues, none of the 100 of us on here can actually be the sole rescuer of a victim of serious violence. And that's the first thing I want to say. No one in the NHS is alone when it comes to supporting a victim or a survivor of serious violence. We must act together. We must act collaboratively. We must act in partnership, because that moment when a victim for many years has the courage to disclose to us as a trusted clinician, that is a moment when we must bear witness to that disclosure, and we must reach out to other colleagues within the healthcare sector, or within the violence reduction centre, or within the community safety partnership sector, and we must work together to protect that person, that citizen, from further violence. We cannot do that. We are not in every living room, and we are not in every bedroom. And so therefore we rely on each other to understand the journey into and the impact of violence in our communities, in our homes, in our places of work. And so therefore we've got to share data. We've got to be brave enough to do it. And I will stand shoulder to shoulder with any clinician who decides, I need to protect the person I've heard from, and I need to pass on a secure amount of data in order for someone else to support their recovery and protect them from further harm. The other thing that we must shine a light on is our own restoration. These are difficult listens when someone discloses serious violence. particularly if it's colleagues, and especially if it's someone within our caseload. And our restoration and our own recovery is absolutely critical. So we must be brave enough to reach into our systems and ask for restorative supervision. Dealing with this can be visceral. It can leave a lasting impact. Not only is the victim and the survivor impacted, but their families are impacted once a disclosure happens, but also the clinicians around that family can be impacted. And so restorative supervision, we need to have a call to action that people that's listening to these disclosures and listening to these recovery plans need our own recovery, because we need to leave this at work rather than go home and worry about it. It is absolutely critical that that restorative supervision avoids us creating a codependency that we, as a clinician, create a codependency that we are the rescuer. We cannot be the sole rescuer of a victim nor a survivor. We must work as a team across our partnerships. And we have a range of excellent services. We have an investment in independent domestic violence advisors. You'll hear about GPIRSI. We have an investment in independent sexual violence advisors. We have other therapists. We have other therapeutic intervention. We have other strength-based services. But more importantly, colleagues, we have lived experience. They have set up their own peer advocacy services, because some of us have never felt the absolute impact of serious violence on ourselves and on our families. And so now is our time to work collaboratively across the Community Safety Partnership and the Integrated Care Partnership with other organisations who have been set up by victims, by survivors, for further victims and future victims. Peer advocacy services are really important for us to work with collaboratively, as well as bringing excellence in practice to victims and survivors, as well as being brave enough to share data, as well as being bold enough to collaborate for recovery and seek our own restorative supervision. The courage of disclosure must also be marked by our own hopefulness. We have a job to do in this, because in the grip of being a victim of serious violence, the horizon can be bleak for them. Because if a victim of serious violence goes to our organisations, our ambulance services, our A&E departments, our major trauma centres, yes, we can fix the physical trauma, but it can take decades to heal the emotional trauma and the recovery back in the areas in which they live, or perhaps even where the violence happened itself. And so we must absolutely match the courage of disclosure with the hope that recovery with support is feasible. And again, that is due to our own hopefulness that together we can deal with the epidemic levels of serious violence that we're beginning to have disclosed to us. So what is within the system that can support us? What is the doing something as system leaders? Well, ICBs, Integrated Care Board colleagues, you have a joint forward plan to draft. And wouldn't it be wonderful if serious violence, the numbers of serious violence is increasing? Wouldn't it be really, it would bear witness to the victims if serious violence duty was part of that joint forward plan. Bearing witness to those victims and survivors might also be a moment to put it in our equality impact assessment. It might be a moment to have it discussed with the violence reduction units, the community safety partnerships, because we are beginning to see a growth in the data set for it. So whatever we're doing, being bold enough to share data about a victim who's disclosed to us, being brave enough to ask for restorative supervision, being courageous enough to bring hope where there's despair with the victims and the survivors. We are here to support you be those system leaders that you need to be. I want to thank you for the opportunity of having a conversation with you, and I am genuinely looking forward to hearing from the speakers who have a foundation of excellence, and particularly from the lived experience colleagues. Thank you, and I'm more than happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Kenny. So I always wonderful to hear you speak, Kenny. Full of passion and genuinely driving the work that we're doing up at NHS England, and really in touch with everyone within the ICB. So to make sure that we can operate, it's not just strategic, it's operationalized, and it really makes an impact in practice. Are there any questions? We're going to give this Slido a go. So the code was 18523, and we will see if there's any questions that come up to Kenny. Fingers crossed. Ken, there's the QR code there, so we'll give everyone a few minutes.
In the meantime, I just want to post one slide about the scale of, I don't use slideshows, that all the presentations are on Futures NHS, the links I've sent you up there, but it is a slide about the cost of serious violence, estimated at 1.9 to 2.3 billion across the NHS. That's not North East London. Don't worry, Cor. I saw you go, oh gosh. I saw the anxiety raised there when Cor. This is across the whole of the NHS. We don't have specific data for North East London, but it just shows you the scale of serious violence in all its forms. 2.3 billion it costs the NHS each year.
So here we go. So I think it's working. So we've got some great feedback so far.
Oh, thank you.
Are there any questions?
Whilst we're waiting for the questions, safeguarding referral done by GP register being rejected. So referrals, safeguarding referrals, colleagues. Quick tip that I've learned as a midwife: never sign a single signature referrals, whether it's a section 42 for adults or a section 17 for children in need. Always have a co-signature, and very powerful co-signatories are the named GPs, or if it's a community pharmacy that was picking up on the serious violence through our scanning, for instance, or if it was a dentist that picked up the pinch and the punch in the facial area. So always have a colleague countersign a section 17 child in need referral if it's a child, and a section 42 referral for additional support and health needs. So if you are having referrals rejected, have a conversation with your designated professional, because your referral is just as valid as a social worker's referral. It is equal, it is of parity. So if they're being declined or rejected, then have a word with the designated professional, how you might embolden that at a later date. How can we ensure multidisciplinary involvement? Yes. How you ensure multidisciplinary involvement is you actually have multi-agency involvement. As I said before, no one on this call, none of the 110 people on this call must ever leave this conference thinking that you're going to be in everyone's living room protecting them. Serious violence is a multi-agency tactic, whether it's domestic abuse, non-fatal strangulation, scamming and online, etc. So let's move towards multi-agency involvement, including primary care, community pharmacy for Ascani, dentistry that pick up on the signs and symptoms of physical assault, sexual health services, great ally when it talks about sexual violence against the person. So multi-agency, multidisciplinary, and the national team regarding serious concerns and local, you can contact the national team, but absolutely, I would always defer to my colleagues who are subject matter experts in the local contextual safeguarding, and that is our designate professionals for children and our designate professionals for adult safeguarding. Absolutely, they know the context of spaces and places. And so your first protocol would be your designates. The second protocol might be your regional teams, but I'm willing to listen and signpost you to those at any time. kenny.gibson@nhs.net. But I often defer to my designate colleagues for that things. I find we're having to chase the outcomes of referrals. Right, my advice on referrals: if you hear nothing within 3 days, chase it and put a tracker on your email. Put a tracker, do a read receipt and tell them you're tracking the email if you hear nothing within 3 days. If you have taken the time to put a referral in, it is critically important you demonstrate chasing. I think I'm keeping up with that.
Yeah. And I think there's some specific borough questions, and obviously Kenny is working at a national level, so wouldn't be able to answer those. I'm just going to ask some of my colleagues to go on mute, please. Just thank you. I know sometimes it can be tricky when we're joining and things, so if you just all sense check if we're just on mute, please. Hang on. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mute all and then I'm going to come off mute. There we go. All done. Right. So some of the local area questions are a little bit challenging, but we have safeguarding forums in each of the areas with your named GP in each of your areas across North East London, and there are safeguarding trainings that happen, and also you have your designated professionals who you should have contact details for, and we're all really happy to be contacted and to have chats with you. So if there is anything, please email us and we can answer your specific area questions. And in relation to, there was something about training certificates, please contact the training hub, and sometimes there is a bit of a delay, but please remember that Training Hub are putting on lots of different training events, so they are working at pace, but sometimes there is a little bit of a lag and it can be a couple of weeks, so please be patient with them. Were there any other questions, Kenny, that you cast your eye on that you would answer right now?
Not per se. It's about this referral process. Value the fact that you did a referral, chase it after 3 days, put tracker on your emails, always have it co-signed.
Brilliant, thank you. And that's a great summary of some take-home messages there, actually. Thank you very much for opening our conference today, Kenny. It's very valued, and your words, as I said before, are always received warmly and valued. So thank you very much. So I'm going, without much further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Josephine Emmanuel, who I have to say a massive thank you to for coming in at the 11th hour, and she's put some slides together. Dr. Emmanuel is a Newham GP with a special interest in domestic abuse, and she's the newly appointed clinical lead for the IRIS programme in Newham, and she's going to be talking about domestic violence and the IRIS programme. So I am going to, without further ado, I'm going to pass you to Dr. Emmanuel.
I'll just try and screen share now. Hopefully it will work. Can you see the slides by any chance now?
Yep, we can see them.
Okay, perfect. So I think when I'm in this mode, I can't really see everybody else. If there are any questions, I think we're doing them at the end anyway. So if I do miss anything, please let me know. So I'll just get started. So hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Emmanuel, or you can call me Jo. I'm a salaried GP in Newham, and just very recently, sort of last month, I've become one of the clinical leads for the IRIS programme, which has just come into Newham and Redbridge. But I understand there are a kind of people attending from different boroughs today, and I think a lot of boroughs already have IRIS running or have had in the past. So hopefully it's useful not just for Newham staff, but everyone as well. And just to say, in Newham, the IRIS programme is being delivered by the London Black Women Project. So I will kind of touch on them at the end as well. Okay. So just as an overview, I'll be going through what is domestic abuse, some statistics around this, and coming on to the IRIS programme with regards to what it is and other support services that are available that the IRIS programme will probably tap into. So the Domestic Abuse Acts of 2021 says that the definition of domestic abuse is a behaviour of a person who is A towards another person B, and it's considered domestic abuse if both A and B are both over 16 years old and they are personally connected to each other, so in a relationship or of some sort, and that the behaviour between them is abusive. So I guess it's quite a broad definition and does cover a lot of things. Hopefully this is quite familiar to you. So these are just different types of domestic abuse. So these are the kind of more common ones that we come across. So physical or threatening behavior. So this might be maybe easier to pick up in terms of if someone presents with an unusual bruise or an injury that doesn't match up with the story they're presenting. Also sexual abuse, which again, it's important to remember that it can still be sexual abuse within relationships and marriage. And I know recently they have amended the definition, so it does include things where maybe consent has not been applied towards the full intercourse. So for example, if someone removes a condom in the middle of the act, that does now count as sexual abuse as well. And the other types coming on to controlling and coercive behavior, which might be a little bit more difficult to tell. And then economic financial abuse. So if, for example, someone is reliant, or if the victim is reliant on the perpetrator for financial reasons, it might be quite difficult for them to leave, or the perpetrator might be withholding their finances or not letting them have a bank account, those kind of things which can inhibit, I guess, them trying to restart their life or make a change if they're not happy with the life that they have at the moment. And then we've also got psychological emotional abuse, and recently also they've also added the abuse via social media, which is for example, if people are putting things on sort of websites of intimate photos or videos without consent, that is now also recognized as a type of domestic abuse as well. So coming on to some data, globally, we know that the WHO has said that about 1 in 3 women worldwide have been subjected to either physical or sexual intimate partner violence, or non-partner any kind of sexual violence in their lifetime. So that's a huge statistics, and I was really surprised when I first saw it. If we think of a secondary school class of 30 girls, for example, to think that 10 of them are going to have some kind of physical or sexual violence towards them in their lifetime, it's quite scary that is kind of current data at the moment. And I know this might not be exactly 1 in 3 in the UK, as this is worldwide, but just thinking about it on a general scheme. And then this data is more specific to Newham. So Newham actually ranks as the second highest borough in terms of volume and rates of domestic abuse offences in London. And that was from 2021, the Mayor's Office of Policing and Crime, and that was from the Newham Early Help Strategy paper in 2022. So it's just showing how, I know this talk is kind of a little bit more focusing on Newham, but I guess generally in London there is a huge amount of domestic abuse, but particularly in Newham as well. So hopefully this IRIS programme can go about to try and reduce the rates and kind of increase the support that we offer. So kind of thinking about why general practice is important in identifying victims. Often we know that primary care is the first point or only point of contact of victims trying to seek help. GP surgeries are often seen as a safe space where if they tell their family member they're going to for an appointment for some kind of women's health, maybe it won't be questioned as much as if they were going to a domestic abuse charities office, for example, on the high street. Also, GP surgeries are generally seen as a place of confidentiality, so they might feel more comfortable disclosing. We see a huge amount of patients, so not just doctors, but kind of nurses, healthcare assistants, midwives, pharmacists, everyone who's in the surgeries do see kind of different ages, gender, children, and pregnant women. And we know, unfortunately, that the rates of domestic abuse is higher in maternity. So it's just for us to kind of be aware and keep our eyes and mind open if there is anything unusual when we are seeing people. And then finally, I guess general practice compared to other specialties probably has a little bit more of a holistic health monitoring, and we know that domestic abuse can present with many different forms, including physical health and mental health symptoms. So again, it's just a way where even without the patient disclosing domestic abuse, we might kind of think actually this person is coming with various symptoms kind of every week, and maybe there's something else going on. So coming on to the IRIS-I. So for those of you who have not heard of it before, IRIS-I is a program, and it stands for the Identification and Referral to Improve Safety. And the small I in IRIS-I stands for interventions in order to achieve this aim. So IRIS-I is a social enterprise that was started in 2017 to promote and improve the healthcare response to domestic violence and abuse. And their vision is a world in which gender-based violence is consistently recognised and addressed as a health issue. And in order to achieve this, their mission is to improve the healthcare response to gender-based violence through health and specialist services working together. As was mentioned earlier, a key thing is that we can't achieve ending any type of violence, but particularly domestic violence, on our own. And as clinicians, often we might be able to pick it up, but then it's about working with the specialist services that can support women in order to kind of provide the best outcome. So the IRIS program is an evidence-based, effective and cost-effective intervention to improve the primary care response to DV, and it is a nationally recognised program. Since it's been first commissioned, it has actually managed to train over 1,200 general practices, general kind of GP surgeries, and more than 25,000 referrals have been made to the advocate educators as part of the IRIS program. And also, since they've launched, so IRIS sites would be kind of boroughs. So they've trained over 45 boroughs across England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And I know they are kind of continuing to train more as we are speaking. So this is a rough model of how the IRIS program works. So on the left, you can see the inputs, which I won't go through all of this in detail because you can see it on the slides, but the main things to kind of point out is that there is the clinical lead and the advocate educator, and I'll come on to their roles on the next slide. And it's about the inputs would be kind of training for the practice in terms of recording on the notes, how to identify domestic violence, how to document, and how to kind of do an immediate risk assessment as well. And then the hopes with the immediate outputs in the middle section would be that we would improve the identification of DV, improve the referrals, and in that way the patient would be able to have an advocate and also the best kind of emotional and practical support. And as part of the IRIS model, they always have ongoing evaluation and monitoring in order to make sure that the referral process is working and that the program is effective in terms of helping victims. So the outcomes in green are the longer term goals, so maybe over kind of many months or years, and it is to improve patient quality of life in terms of physical health, mental health, and socially. Also overall to kind of reduce the rates of abuse by kind of promoting awareness around it as well. And also improving kind of GP surgeries CPD, as the training does count as CPD points, and kind of your professional development as well. And this is a quote from an IRIS service user from a different borough, and they said they feel like the service has helped me through one of the toughest parts of my life and has given me the self-belief and courage to be me again. And I thought this was quite nice in terms of actually hearing from a patient or a victim who has been referred to IRIS and actually felt like they've been able to kind of rebuild their lives and have that self-belief to kind of restart things and have a better quality of life, which is the main aim. So this slide maybe is slightly more specific to Newham, although it does also apply to Redbridge, who have their own clinical leads and advocate educators. So our next steps are encouraging GP practices to sign up to IRIS. Once you have signed up, I'll come on to slide later with the email that you can email if you're interested. The next step would be that we would provide training to the practice, usually on a one-to-one, so we train one practice at a time, just so that it can be more kind of more space for questions, and we can kind of tailor it to your practice timing and needs as well. So the clinicians usually have 2 clinical training sessions, which are 2 hours each. They're usually about 6 to 8 weeks apart, and the first one is delivered by the advocate educator and the clinical lead, and that would be kind of involving a refresher in more detail of domestic violence, how to identify, how to record, how to do the referral, those kind of things. And then 6 weeks later, the follow-up is usually with the advocate educator, so that it's more of a touch-in to find out if the referral system has been working, if you found it useful, or if you've had any problems maybe with the referral pathway. And also sometimes I think in other boroughs they've noticed that clinicians sometimes like having the refresher of how to document and safely, and kind of being kind of data aware as well. For the non-clinical staff, which would be more the reception and admin team, that's usually an hour, just one 1-hour session delivered by the advocate educator, and it's just so that they can code things properly, and kind of being more aware to pick up from any letters that come in from external sources, so that they can let the safeguarding lead know if anything pops up. So coming on to kind of the roles, so the clinical lead, as Bina mentioned earlier, so I'm one of the clinical leads in Newham, and Shopnara is the other clinical lead for Newham as well. So we're both GPs, kind of working in Newham, and then the advocate educator is someone who has been working many years in the social sector with domestic violence organisations and different companies and programs, so they have a lot more knowledge in terms of knowing which services might be best, and also how to speak with victims, and kind of keeping that confidentiality and helping them to open up. So usually what would happen is, once you've had the training, then you would be given the email for the advocate educator, and you can just email them directly. And then the advocate educator should usually reply to your email within about 48 hours to let you know they've received it. And then they will contact the patient directly themselves and offer kind of support and do onward referrals to the different organisations that are available locally. And there will be some ongoing communication between the advocate educator and the practice in terms of emails. So you're if you're kind of signed up to the IRIS program, you can always email the advocate educator if you want an update on a particular patient as well. So the benefits of IRIS compared to, I guess, not having IRIS is that there is a training for the whole practice, which is can count towards your safeguarding points and also your CPD. You have a named contact, which is the advocate educator. So for example, when you're in a busy clinic and there's a patient in front of you who's just disclosed to you, and you only have kind of a few minutes left, you can just email the advocate educator. You don't need to kind of sit there Googling what is the best organisation to refer the patient to. So hopefully it would help kind of save time and give you that comfort that you're doing a good referral. That's going to help. Like we said, there is ongoing communication and updates from the advocate educator. They can also attend practice meetings. Usually they do this every 2 to 3 months to kind of provide you with an update of the referrals they've had and the outcome in terms of if the case is still open or if it's been closed, so that you can see if you need to reach out to the patient again. They can also see the patients in your practice if you have space, and if that's something you would like them to do in terms of if maybe the patient feels more comfortable coming to the practice. The IRIS program is mainly for female victims, but if there are any male patients or perpetrators that you come across that disclose to you, then you can still email the advocate educator, and they would be able to kind of then refer them onwards to the local groups that can support them for those particular groups of patients. And another key aim is not a key aim, but a key benefit that we've noticed is that 70% of service users report visiting their GP less after being referred to an advocate educator. So as you can imagine, just thinking of examples that I've seen, patients have often presented with kind of neck pain, headaches, feeling tired. They might present every couple of weeks to the GP surgery, and once they've disclose that there is some history of domestic violence or current domestic violence, and we've done a referral to an appropriate organisation, then often we notice that they're contacting us less, which means that you would be kind of saving appointments, which is good for the practice, which when we know we're kind of oversubscribed for appointments, but also good for the patient because it's a sign that their quality of life is improved and they don't actually feel the need to contact their GP as much. And this is a quote from a GP who has been trained with IRIS program and has referred patients in. So they said, "I'm now convinced that violence against women and children is a major public health problem with long-term consequences for women and their families. As an experienced GP, the whole project has been nothing short of transformational." So again, I thought this was quite a nice quote, kind of highlighting the key aim of the IRIS program in terms of recognizing that domestic violence is not just a social sector problem, but it is a public health problem. It is a health problem, which means that it is something that clinicians should be aware of and trying to work together with the social sector to improve it kind of in the long term. these are just some support services that are available. So the London Black Women Project, who are commissioned to deliver the IRIS programme for Newham, they are based in Newham, and they usually offer support for primarily, I think, Black, Asian and ethnic women who are kind of victims of domestic violence, and they also provide housing for women outside of Newham who are relocating to Newham as well. And just a key note to point out that although it's London Black Women Project who are commissioned, the IRIS programme is open to all women, so all race. It's not kind of exclusive to just ethnic minorities. The Hestia programme is probably something you've heard of. It's more of a national service, again, which you can refer to. Usually they have an email and they're very quick at replying. And also we've got Refuge and Sign Health, which is the deaf health charity. So I've referred patients to them before, and they're very good at contacting patients via text or video calls and face-to-face appointments, so that they can do BSL sign language translating as well. And then Beverly Lewis House is the UK's only refuge for women with learning disabilities. So just some organisations that are there for domestic violence. I know there's probably hundreds more, but these are ones that we've used kind of locally. So as we mentioned, with the IRIS programme, if you are signed up, then you would refer just to the advocate educator, and they would then do the onward referral, maybe to one of these organisations or to a different one, depending on what's best for the patient. But this is just for you to kind of be aware if you're not signed up to IRIS, or in the meantime, just some organisations that might be able to help. I think that's everything from me. So I'll come back and stop screen sharing, I think. Oh yeah, I think that's fine. Yeah, I think that's everything. I don't know if anyone has any questions.
That was brilliant, Dr. Emmanuel. Thank you so much. There's been some questions in the chat, and I can speak a little bit to Iris. So one thing I will say about the picture across North East London is City and Hackney were the pilot site for Iris, because the founder of Iris was actually a City and Hackney GP, so North East London GP. And City and Hackney were the pilot site, and they maintained the programme, and they've managed to sustain the commissioning of Iris there. We have Iris in Tower Hamlets, we have it in Waltham Forest, we now have it in Newham thanks to the Violence Reduction Unit at the Mayor's Office for funding, and we have it in Redbridge. We did have it in Barking and Dagenham. However, that because it came again from the Violence Reduction Unit, it was limited funding, and it didn't continue. We don't currently have it in Havering. Iris is often commissioned by the local authorities, public health, community safety partnership. And as we know, government budgets are slashed in the local authorities massively. It's not to say it's not a priority, and the community safety partnership in the local authorities and the ICB are working together to tackle violence and domestic abuse. And there is a work stream in the safeguarding team at the ICB that is looking at provision for clinicians for identifying domestic abuse. But as I'm sure you all appreciate, it's quite a complex issue. So that is my kind of the picture of North East London and what we're doing at scale to put in provision and try and tackle it. But I'm going to be quiet now and let Dr. Emmanuel answer the questions about Iris.
So just having a look at the questions, I can see someone has asked, I think Sheetal asked about the so asked about whether if the GP is in Newham but the patient is in Redbridge, if we can still refer the patient to the Newham advocate educator. So I think if the patient is registered with a GP in Newham, then and you're IRIS trained, then I think you can refer to the advocate educator, and what they would usually do is kind of speak with the patient and then refer them to the appropriate service. So it might be that they then discuss with the Redbridge advocate educator and see if they will take them on in their case workload. But that's something I'll have to check, because I guess then in terms of the Newham advocate educator then feeding back to you with updates, it might be that they still keep them on their books but then transfer them to the appropriate agencies more local for the patients. Just looking at the other questions. In terms of signing up with Iris, I will. I realised I'd missed out from my slide. There is a London Black Women Project email that I'll put in the chat. So, and I'll put my email as well. So if you email us and just say what surgery you're from and who is the best person to email in terms of if there's a practice manager or a safeguarding lead that we can email to kind of discuss about when would be a good time to come and do the training, then that would be probably the best way. There's a huge ask when we are in GP practice or under extraordinary pressure, can reaccreditation be streamlined? I'm guessing that's to do, because it's a question that's come up. I think that's to do with the training, because if it's 2 lots of 2 hours, when we had our training for the trainers a few weeks ago, I did kind of bring this up because it's come up before, and I think what was mentioned was that it's not ideal, but we can change it to 2 lots of 1 hour sessions. So it can be done over a lunch break, for example, maybe on a Tuesday lunch, and then next week we come again on Tuesday lunch. It can be done face to face, but it can also be done remotely over Zoom or Microsoft Teams so that more staff can join as well. We realize it is quite a big ask if you have to block out clinics, which is not ideal if it's 2 hours. So that's why the 2 lots of 1 hour might work. The other option is that I know in Newham we have the protected learning time, the PLT. I think it's once a month. I know it might be changing to once every 2 months. So there is we are in talks with maybe training 2 or 3 practices in one go, and kind of using that protected time if your surgery does close for that you would have this safeguarding Iris training instead of going to the PLT. So that's a possibility. Just again, like I said, if you email us, we can speak with each practice individually, because different things might work for different practices. And also, I remember last time in the safeguarding talk when I did, Sabina mentioned a really good point about how we do our BLS training once a year, and that's usually about 4 hours, or at least in my practice it was 4 hours, and we don't complain, not that we don't complain, but we make time for it. And I guess if you're thinking that domestic violence does cost life, people do die from it, and the rates are huge, especially when it's such a big problem in Newham. It's, we're kind of then asking, can we reduce the training to reduce the kind of efficacy of us being able to identify and refer, to reduce the rates. So I know it sometimes doesn't feel like it, because life support training, BLS, does seem more important, but it's just kind of thinking about the importance of both. We got Iris designation, it's good training, but the biggest barrier is the fact that the practice has to go offline for a whole day. I'm not sure who the question is from. Is that for the training going offline, I think? Because it shouldn't be for the whole day, because usually it is 2 hours or 2 lots of 1 hour, and then the second session is 6 to 8 weeks later. So maximum, it might be that if you did want to do it in 2 hours in one go, that we do it over lunch and you kind of delay starting clinic by an hour, or maybe, I don't know if practices have 2 hour lunch breaks, which I know usually not, because you have admin. But I don't imagine it shouldn't be a whole day, because it's only a 2 hour session, and for the non-clinical staff it's only 1 hour, which will usually be on a different day. So it might be that if needed we could do it in 2 batches if you want to do half the staff in each go, so that you don't have to kind of hire extra staff to cover for the non-clinical, sorry. And then how to sign up for Iris, I will put the email in the chat. I'm just trying to find it in my old slides. I don't know if there's any other questions or if I've missed anything in the chat.
I couldn't see anything else in the chat. Thank you for going through the questions. I think this Slido is actually working quite well, so everyone can see things. So thank you, and thank you for supporting this to our team in the background. Yeah, I do say this a lot. We do BLS, and the one thing that is very sobering is when you sit on domestic homicide reviews and it's the coulda, shoulda, woulda. And actually it's too late then. It's far too late then. And I've sat on the domestic homicide reviews now. Domestic homicide is a public health emergency. And there is a direct correlation between serious youth violence and domestic abuse. So it's not an isolated incident, and it has the effects ricocheted. So my plea is, if you are privileged enough to have Iris in your borough, please take it up, because it it makes an immense difference. And our advocate educators are godsends. What they do and what they do for your the service user is immense. They write letters, they support, they counsel, they go through, and they take a lot of time, and it's a lot of time we don't have. And the other thing is, the last bit is, it provides reception or admin staff training, because actually our admin staff and our reception staff see so much. I keep on seeing, is Iris available in Havering? No. Iris at present isn't available in Havering, but as I said, there is a domestic abuse work streams within the ICB, and each local authority has their community safety partnership, and domestic abuse is high on the agenda. And as Kenny Gibson was talking about in his keynote speech, there's the safeguarding, there's the serious violence duty even, and that's looking at the strategic plan. So while things may not be in place in your area at present, hopefully watch this space. There's a lot of work that is taking place in the background, but please make use of our clinical leads and our teams in each of the areas if you do have it. So thank you very much. Now, without further ado, I am going to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Lethan Bartholomew. He is head of children and young people at Young Londoners team at Greater London Authority. He was the head of the National FGM Centre until, I believe, last year, and he is a subject matter expert in harmful practices. I've been privileged enough to hear Dr. Bartholomew speak on several occasions, and each time I learn something new. So I'm looking forward to hearing him speak today. So let me pass you to Dr. Bartholomew. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sabina. Let me just share my screen. I hope you can see that. I'm trying to put it on. Okay, here it is. Okay, fantastic. So let's start. Right. So as Sabina said, my name is Lethan Bartholomew, and my presentation will be looking at harmful practices. Now, I'll take you through what I actually mean by harmful practices, and then I would focus on one harmful practice that's called around child abuse linked to faith and belief, and we'll talk a bit more in detail about it. I only have 30 minutes. This could be a long day training. All right. Well, 25 minutes of questions, and this could be an entire day training or even 2 days training. So I'll put my email address at the end in the chat, and if you have any follow-up questions, you can ask me as well, because with questions, it's either it goes two ways. One is people actually say nothing because they're shocked and they need time to process it, or I have a flurry of questions just to ask. So to start off, harmful practices. What do we actually mean by harmful practices? Because any harm that happens to someone who could say that that's a harmful practice. But according to the United Nations, there is a definition for harmful practices. Before, it used to be called harmful traditional practices, but about 11 years ago, they dropped the traditional part, and we now call it just harmful practices. And as it says here, this is like a bite-sized definition or understanding of harmful practices from the UN. So these are practices that are persistent, practices and behaviors, and they're grounded in discrimination based on sex, gender, age, and other grounds. So it could be disability, it could be religion as well. And they intersect with multiple forms of violence or discrimination. So we're talking about polyvictimization, and what I mean by that is someone could experience one form of harmful practice, and then it's a gateway for them to experience other forms of harmful practices in their life. And it involves violence, and it causes psychological harm as well. Right. So when we're looking at harmful practices, it violates an individual's human rights. It's grounded in discrimination. We're talking about harmful practices within the context of their traditional ones. They are re-emerging harmful practices, and they are new ones. So they are emerging harmful practices, and they cause that psychological harm, damage, and it removes the enjoyment of human rights. Now, if I was supposed to list all the harmful practices out there, can go into the hundreds. So I've just put some harmful practices here that I think that you all most likely will be aware of. FGM falls under that category of harmful practices: forced marriage, early forced marriage, force feeding children, menstruation, ostracization, and honor-based abuse. Male circumcision actually falls within that as well, but that we have a number of caveats for that within our context. We're looking at male circumcision as a harmful practice. But for our purposes today, so for probably the next 15 to 20 minutes, we will be looking at a harmful practice that's called child abuse linked in faith and belief. Now, this is a map that comes from the National FGM Center website. It's a fantastic map. It's evidence-based, so wherever there's research, you can go by each country, and if you hover over it, it will give you what the research says, what's the data, and the link to the paper that you can actually read within your own time. And there are a list of other resources, a number of other resources there on the National FGM Center website. Now, when we're talking about harmful practices, we have a general belief that these things happen. It doesn't happen here in the UK. It doesn't happen here in the West. These are other people's problems. But an academic called Sheila Jeffreys did a piece of work who led on the harmful practices work for the UN just over a decade ago, wrote a book that's called Misogyny and Beauty. And in her book, she makes the argument that harmful practices is an issue for the West. It's the way that how we discuss it and we package it. We think that it's more for us, it's more an issue around medicine or fashion, or it's about choice. And when we frame it in that way, we don't see it as a harmful practice, when in reality, it is a harmful practice. So, for example, when we talk about labiaplasty, the argument is it can be done for medical reasons. Some people argue it's the same thing as FGM, but for us in the West, we frame it slightly differently. So it's allowed for one group, but not another group. Right. I wouldn't go through this entire slide, but these are some of the harmful practices that Sheila Jeffreys in her book says that happens here in the West, but we don't frame it in that way at all. Now, harmful practices can happen at any point in time in someone's life. It happens from when you're a baby straight into adulthood. This is really supposed to be a loop, as opposed to looking at it at milestones in someone's life. So as I said, that you can experience more than one harmful practice. So you could experience FGM, but then you could experience forced marriage later on in life, or you could experience child abuse linked to faith or belief. Now, when we're looking at child abuse linked to faith and belief, there is actually a national action plan for us here in the UK that was developed since around 2011, following the death of a child who was murdered, the family thought that he was possessed by an evil spirit. So that's Christy Bamu. It's an umbrella term, and there are many different beliefs that comes under this umbrella term. So one is witchcraft accusations. So when we're talking about witchcraft accusation, it's that belief that the individual, adult or child, they have this psychic ability to cause harm to other people. So I can just sit here, I can think ill of you, I don't have to do any concoctions, I don't have to go through any rituals, but I have that ability to cause you harm. Then there is spirit possession, where is the belief that someone is their spirit has been suppressed and they're now occupied by another entity. We're not talking about spirit possession within a positive context, how Christians talk about being possessed by the Holy Spirit, but we actually mean it within a pathological sense, where they're now occupied by something that's an evil force that's affecting them, mainly affecting them. But they could also cause, in some situations, some people believe they could also cause harm to others. Then we have beliefs like evil eye, or as I have here, multi-murders. So that's using of body parts, or killing someone and using their body parts in rituals, where in some countries it happens to people with albinism. And in the UK here, we know years ago, there was a torso that was found in the Thames, which is Boy Adam. And in cases where there is modern slavery and exploitation, victims are taken through a ritual in order to silence them. And in those situations, they can take pubic hair, menstrual blood, urine. They take something that's intimate to that individual and put them through that ritual, which silences them. So for you as a medical practitioner, meeting someone who's been through that process of being trafficked or exploited, and they're not sharing information with you, they're drip feeding information, because it's that fear that if they do say something, harm can happen to them, because it's a form of control that they've been put through this ritual. So it's really important to be mindful of that. Now, so just moving on. So this thinking about terminology. So what they say is that terminology is really important because we need to understand it from the perspective of the survivor or the victim, and they would use a terminology. Now, the difficulty is that there are individual or group variations in understanding these things. So it's really important to try to suspend your understanding of it a bit. You may have some understanding of it, but try to get it from their perspective. What does it actually really mean? So I'll go through this list. I will send Sabina the definitions, but in different communities, they use slightly different terms. Some of it does overlap. But the main thing is use the terminology they use, but get from the individual their understanding of what it actually really. Now, who's most vulnerable to these things when we talk about spirit possession witchcraft? It depends on the country. In some countries, it's more women. Traditionally, has always been women disadvantaged by this form of harmful practice. The elderly, mainly women as well. Children being accused is really a modern phenomenon that started up more in the early 90s, but there's evidence going back to the 1970s in Cameroon, where children started to be accused, and then there was a big gap of 20 years. But since the 1990s, there's been in many countries across the world, children being accused, and also pregnant women. So women, especially if a mother dies during childbirth, in some communities, the child will be blamed for that. So the child will be considered to be a witch that caused the death of that child. So of the mother. So pregnancy is what is called a liminal state. And a liminal state meaning you're neither here or there because you're pregnant. Anyone that's in a liminal state is considered to be someone that's at risk of being accused. So a child with a disability is in a liminal state because they're perceived to be like a half human. So God half created them because they have a disability. So in some situations, having a child with a disability means that you have been cursed. And that child need to be returned to God, so would not invest much energy in that child's development at all. Or it could be a situation where in some countries they're killed, they're murdered, or they're left and they're abandoned. Right. So just going a bit more into the belief system, because it's really important for you to understand it for the things I'm going to say later on. Now, the belief is that we live in this world where we are here now, in this physical world, but there's also, we hear on the internet, we conversing, delivering this session, there's also the cyber world. And also there's the spiritual and the invisible realm that exists, where there are entities that exist there. Now, only a few of us in this physical world, we are adept engaging with, speaking to entities that exist in the spiritual world. But the spiritual world has control over everything, the physical and the cyber world. So to give you a quick example, an individual could be looking at indecent images on his laptop and get caught by the police. Now, a perfect explanation for his behavior would be, well, I did not do it. I didn't have any control. It's what was in the spiritual world controls what happens in my physical world and in the cyber world, and they made me do it. So I kind of like exonerate myself and don't accept any responsibility for what has happened at all, because there's this belief that what happened in the spiritual world could influence anything that happens in the physical world, including my behavior. So with that in mind, it's really important for us to really try to understand people's worldview, their religion, their ideology, and how that changes over time. Now, it will make much sense because of this. Now, we have this belief system, the spiritual world, there's the spiritual realm. But then what happens to us is that these belief systems, they exist, but they kick in when we experience misfortune. And misfortune could be a range of many different things. So as you can see, it's listed there. Then what happened is that behind every what in my life, there's a who. So what is going on in my life that's not positive, there's something or someone that's causing it. So if I'm experiencing mental illness, physical illness, I have a child with a disability, there's domestic abuse in my relationship, I can say that my partner, she's not listening to me because she has a spiritual husband. So that means that in the spiritual realm, she has a husband there. And I mean, these things may seem very warped, but in reality, a lot of people have this belief system, and it's the spiritual husband that's causing problems in our physical marriage in this physical realm. So any misfortune that I may experience, I may have a sick child, I may have diabetes, I may have hypertension. There's a reason. I could probably accept a scientific explanation for it, but it still does not explain why me and not you, why me and not my neighbor. So I'm trying to rationalize and understand, why am I having this misfortune in my life? I can go to the GP to get help, and that's good, but you're just helping with the symptoms. You're not helping me with the cause. So now the question, not really a question, but the issue is that, or what I wanted to bring now is, how does this fit in with today's topic, domestic abuse? So we know that a woman could be blamed for what's happening in the relationship, and the partner can say it's a spiritual reason why she's behaving this way. And we know that women are obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but women are blamed for issues within relationships, which is unfortunate. But a perfect explanation for that is that because she isn't listening to me, because it's a spiritual issue. She's probably a witch as well. Now, serious youth violence, we know that, or crime in general, there's always been a relationship between the occult and crime, whether it is that gangs in many different countries, and there's some evidence, that anecdotal evidence, that happens here as well. They use the occult in order to either protect them or to gain wealth. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to audit a number of cases for a local authority, and in one case, it was a young boy around 19 at the time, and he was stabbed. And what his mother did, his mother took him to someone in the community to perform a ritual on him, so he will be protected. And if he experiences any form of violence, it would not harm him, it would not kill him, because he's been through this ritual that will protect him. So just imagine, from a young person's perspective, being told that you're now protected and you're involved in gang and in violence, the level of invincibility that might give you. We know that there are a number of cases over the years. Victoria Columbier, we know about Kyra Ishak, and it's really important for us to understand that Africans or Asians don't hold a monopoly on these issues. It's an international problem. We may have more cases from one group than another in the UK, but in other countries, we do know that across Europe and even in America, there are cases of witchcraft and spirit possession accusations against children and adults. And these are just an example of some of the cases here in the UK. Now, mental health does feature in many of these cases, but in the majority of the cases, the parents actually don't have a mental health problem at all. And in many of the cases, the children actually remain with their parent. Now, let's quickly think about prevalence. Now, the Department for Education, with their child in need census data, so we know that annually local authorities must send data to the Department for Education on the number of assessments done on certain issues. So, for example, domestic abuse, parental substance misuse, and also child abuse linked to faith and belief. Now, you can look at this data by local authority as well, so you will know how many cases in your local authority Children's Services have done an assessment on witchcraft and spirit possession. So we know that this data, they started to collect it in 2016-17, and since then we've had in total 11,030 cases. Now, there are actually more cases of this that's done for assessments done than FGM as well. So it's just to put it within perspective. Now, just quickly looking at research. Now, this is the first piece of research that was done in the UK, and it was done by Eleanor Stobart. And what Eleanor found was that there was 38 cases involving 47 children. So she looked at cases between 2000 and 2006. And some of the common features in these cases were children with a disability or illness, challenging behavior, sleepwalking, bedwetting, and bad dream. Now, in enuresis, we know that with children from a very small age, bedwetting is a normal thing for children, but there's a deeper meaning for many people. And it means that, I remember in one case, a parent said to me, bedwetting means the urine means that the child is actually in the spiritual realm, and it's fuel that they're using to travel to another country to cause harm to people spiritually. So in any form of illness which is a misfortune, it's really about trying to understand it from their perspective. Yes, it might be a scientific explanation, but there's also probably a spiritual explanation of why this is actually happening, and that's really important to explore. So what Eleanor found was that many of these children who were accused, they were beaten, they were burned, they had cutting, semi-strangulation. So they will strangle that child to the point of near death to fool the spirit in that child, to make them think that they're actually dying. So they will leave the body. So that's why it's semi-strangulation and not strangulation. They will starve them. Starving means it's really is that why would I want to feed an evil spirit that can cause me harm? So they would starve that child. They will put chemicals in the child's eye or pepper in the child's eye, because why would I want an evil spirit to see me to cause me harm? So there's a reason behind why the harm is actually happening. The beating is to cause a lot of discomfort for that evil spirit that's within that child. It could be an adult as well. Okay. Right. So these are some of the indicators. So as some of the things I've said already, disability, bedwetting, nightmares, illnesses, epilepsy. In many countries, epilepsy does not exist. I'm also a trustee of an organization called Medical Assistance Sierra Leone, and we work on epilepsy in Sierra Leone. And one of the beliefs is that people with epilepsy, they are actually possessed by an evil spirit. And that's why they fall on the ground, they throw it to the mouth, they wet themselves because they're being taken over by this evil spirit. And getting people to take the medication, sometimes it's a really difficult thing. Ugliness as well. If a child is too ugly, that means that they're probably possessed. If a child is too intelligent and much smarter than the parent, or if you're gifted, that is also an indication that it possibly could be an evil spirit, because these spirits are very much intelligent beings. And if your child is too intelligent and much more intelligent than the parent, that is obviously a concern. So you're looking at things that are not considered to be the norm. It might be a norm for us and developmentally okay for a child, but what does it actually mean culturally or religiously for another group? Right, so some of the risk indicators. So many of these children come from a background where they are scapegoated. The family structure is very much complex. So reconstituted families, step parents as well, and where there are families where there is a child with a disability. Private fostering arrangement as well. There are many children are found in private fostering arrangements. If you could let me know when I have 5 minutes left, that'll be great, Sabina. Right. So I have now to just extend the conversation. So this was a case that happened in Hackney. I used to work in Hackney up until 2016, but this case happened in 2011. It was a parent, mom. She became psychotic, and over a two-week period, she murdered her daughter. She cut her open, 4-year-old daughter, took out her organs, put it all over the house. The 14-year-old sister came home from school, found her sister's body, found the organs, and you can imagine the trauma that this child went through. Now, I then couldn't find any data, any research that looked at siblings. So what's the impact of an accusation on one child, but also what's the impact on siblings? So this is when I decided to do a PhD. And my PhD focused on accusations of witchcraft and spirit possession against children, but also looking at it from the non-accused perspective, so looking at the both groups. I was lucky enough to be given access to a police force database, and and also I interviewed survivors, their siblings, and professionals as well, and parents as part of that. And I did a freedom of information request to all police forces and children's services across the country to get data on both groups of children. So this is just the data that I'm showing here is just from the police force that gave me access to their database. And what they so in this PhD I did, I extended the work beyond what Eleanor Stobart did. Now, I found between this 3 years, 2014, 15, and 16, 132 recorded cases. But when I looked at it in more detail, it was 78 cases of witchcraft and spirit possession, and involving 98 children. Now, similar to Eleanor Stobart, many of the children were beaten, they were cut. The cutting is actually really done where they cut them open, and the cut supposed to be like an opening for the evil spirit to leave the body. So they will cut the stomach, for example, hoping that whatever inside will come out. Many, children were neglected, but in the majority of cases, it was the emotional abuse, physical abuse, and also sexual abuse, because the rituals that they put child through to exorcise them from an evil spirit, many of it involves a sexual element as well. Most of the children had behavioral problems, special 5-minute educational needs, autism, and mental health concerns. So in some sense, it was very much similar to Eleanor Stobart. So as you can see, it was emotional abuse. The majority of them experienced emotional abuse. Now, for yourself, it's really important to understand that when a parent, so most of these cases are actually mothers who were accusing and faith leaders, but the top perpetrator was actually mothers or stepmothers. Now, when you have this belief and you experience it, you need to employ some form of safety behavior. So if you think along the lines, if someone is being stalked, if you're being stalked, you employ safety behavior. You may change your route to work or home, you'll change your locks. I need to employ safety behavior to protect myself and my family. So some of the questions around safety behavior is that some of it overlap, but they're individual variations. Now, there are websites that people can go to, and they give them some direction. So if you Google Rukia Center, you will find that on these websites, you could self-diagnose yourself, and you could connect to someone online. You pay by PayPal, and they give you advice. So you don't have to physically go anywhere anymore. Now, with this safety behavior is really to understand who's performing it and for how long. If you're giving medical advice, it's good to try to understand as well what other advice they are getting that's non-medical, because if they think it's a spiritual problem, the spiritual problem would require going to someone who can give spiritual advice. So they may take your advice on board as a medic, but the spiritual advice they're being given, it will be much more important. So with the medical advice, therefore the spiritual advice, does it have a cost? Are they paying for it? Because many people are exploited on many high streets, as well. In some areas, if you know where to go, you can go to get psychic advice, and especially with women with domestic abuse who have immigration issues. There have been cases where these psychics are taking money from them, and obviously the advice that they're giving is really about exploitation. Is there international dimension? Because some people are taken overseas, or some people they come over here and they go to them for advice. And just remember as well, as I said, the internet has a part to play. And then what happens if it doesn't work? Because if it's spiritual advice that's being given and it doesn't work, they then go to someone else. So the exploitation that they're getting, it continues from one person to the next. And what's the desired outcome for that child or adult? Now, I want to round up quickly by just quickly talking about this case. I probably think I have probably just 1 minute. So I wouldn't read the entire thing, but this is a case that I was involved in involving a young boy. And he has speech and language difficulties. He attends a special school, and he has a statement of special educational needs. He also has a younger sister. Now, the father is self-employed, the mother doesn't work, she attends a local college. They have financial difficulties, and they're finding Richard's behavior difficult to cope with. Richard goes to school. The teacher sees that he has a plaster on his neck. She goes to touch it to say to him, hey, what's this about? And he says, no, you can't remove it, because if you remove it, the devil will return. That then prompts his teacher to contact the father to find out what exactly happened to his son with this plaster on his neck and the devil returning. Now, the father said to him, said to the teacher, she took Richard to have hijama performed on him. Now, can't go into detail about hijama, but you can Google hijama clinic and it will come up. So it's an Islamic practice that's done for, you can do it for a range of health problems, where they lightly cut your skin with a blade, and then a heated glass cup is put over it, and it sucks all the bad blood, right? Dark, thick blood. You can do it if you suffer from hypertension or diabetes, but also if you believe that you're being affected by evil spirits, for example, by jinn. So he had this practice performed. Now, raised concerns, referred to children's services. The social worker then took him for a CP medical. The concern is that the community pediatrician said that families really allowed to practice their belief. He sees nothing wrong with what happened to Richard at all, because it's a religious practice. And in his report, he said that it raised obviously red flags. It came to me because I was the person who was leading on this in the local authority in Hackney, and I had a meeting with the community pediatrician. And we discussed it. And his main issue was that the main blocker for him is that he came from a community where hijama is practiced. And as a child, it was practiced on children in his community, not here in the UK though. And so he saw nothing wrong with it. But the thing about it is that with hijama, it can be done by anyone in your backyard or in your back garden. You don't know if the blade that's using, if it's hygienic. You don't know who this individual is doing it, how many children they're doing it on. And there was a test case that happened previously in Yorkshire where hijama was performed on this young boy, who similar case where the father thought that he was possessed. And what the judge said was that any child that's being its context is really important, and any child that's having hijama performed, it will be considered to be a vulnerable child, and will be considered to be child abuse. Finally, to round up, what happened is that this pediatrician then agreed to medically examine the child again, and then he wrote an addendum report, and he had blood tests done, just because obviously bloodborne viruses, we don't know who done it. The father never actually told us where it was done or who did it. All he said it was done somewhere in Finsbury Park, and he couldn't remember where he went to. So in this case, it's really important for us to remember that our own personal beliefs may creep into our judgment. Is really important to discuss cases with others and consider obviously the needs of the child. There are not many organizations out there that can provide support, but these are just a few. Inform is really good. They're based at King's College London and also the National FGM Centre, and there are also resources on their website that you can access. So the main lesson I really want to say to you is that as doctors, you're going to come in contact with people who experience a misfortune with regard to their health. They came to you for a reason, so they would most likely follow your advice, but it's really important to understand if the spiritual element of it, because if they believe that there's a spiritual problem, it requires a spiritual way to resolve it. And it may have two competing beliefs, and you're best placed to really ask those questions, because being a health professional, people are more likely to engage with you and answer your question. And the main thing is that if you come across a case where a child has been accused of being possessed, should warrant you having at a minimum a conversation with your safeguarding lead or with Children's Services.
Thank you, Lethan. Always taking away from every time you speak. I'm going to go to the Slido question. So we've got some there already.
First one, I think it then it kind of links in with the second question around psychosis as well. I think that you're right, it is challenging. The level of knowledge that professionals have of this issue is very much minimal. What I've found in many cases that if there's another issue, professionals, let's say if it's domestic abuse, or another form of harm to a child, they will focus on that and minimize beliefs around witchcraft and spirit possession, or just any form of spiritual beliefs whatsoever. In many communities, mental health doesn't exist. It will be easier for you to think that you have a spiritual problem than a mental health problem, because as well, if you have poor mental health, the stigma that's attached to that runs straight, the belief is run straight through the bloodline. So if my sister has it and people know, they will think I have a mental health problem as well. It affects my ability to find a partner in my community. So it could, yes, you're right, it could be mistaken for psychosis. Now, the difficulty is that there are, it's not about us saying that these beliefs are weird, they're warped, they're strange, because the global majority actually believe in these things. And if you don't, you're actually the minority. So it's always really important to take it from that person's perspective and try to understand what does it mean for them? How does it affect parenting capacity? What are the safety behaviors they're employing? Who are they taking the child to see? What advice is being given by not only family members, but by others as well? And in some cases, this is generational. So the child may present as the one that's an issue, but there's probably an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent, a cousin along the generations that has also experienced this as well.
Okay. I think the thing that we've got some more questions coming through. I'll let you go, Lethan.
Okay. Have you ever come across FGM as a domestic abuse? Actually, that's an interesting question, because when you look at the definition for domestic abuse, FGM does fall under domestic abuse. And it's really important to say as well that research does show, some research done in sub-Saharan Africa, that girls who have experienced FGM are at a higher risk of experiencing domestic abuse later on in life. And that's the polyvictimization part of it. So they experience they're more at risk of experiencing multiple forms of violence, which includes domestic abuse. So that's survivors of FGM. Sorry, next one. Okay, I suppose this is probably a much more generic question, right? That what do you do when, because this could be for any concern, when an already safeguarded family, the social worker raises another concern back to the GP. What more can the GP do? I think this is one of those things, messages from serious case reviews and serious and safeguarding practice reviews, is that it's really important never to take the issue that's presented to you as a single issue. So even if they're safeguarded and because of another issue and another issue comes up, it doesn't mean that the issue that you're already safeguarding would not present itself again. So it's really important to take this as in its totality, and what's the experience of this child of experiencing multiple forms of safeguarding concerns. So I would say what more you can do as a GP is don't look at this case in isolation. Look at it in the context of what has happened before as well, but also and what does actually mean for that child. And what more you can do is just be part of that safeguarding process and think about information sharing and what information that you need to share.
Yeah, and I always reflect on the FGM case we had in Northern Forest, and the const of that was there was another
Yes.
child in that family. It wasn't just about FGM. There were harmful practices and witchcraft belief, and that Northern Forest was the first UK case to secure a conviction for FGM that took place in the UK, and there were harmful practices, and it's about context, as Lethan mentioned, and looking at the wider family. So in Northern Forest, we talk about think family, and Lethan has just re-emphasized that point. And what I would say is, if something else comes back to you, re-refer in and be brave. Be brave to say, I think we need to get a meeting with many professionals. It doesn't have to be social care that calls that meeting. And just because you're calling that meeting in primary care, it doesn't mean you're going to hold it then when you've already got so much to do. It might just be initiating the conversation and bringing around all the people who can help safeguard that individual and that family to initiate that process. And there's another question for you, Lethan, on cupping.
Yeah, on cupping. So I think there's it just to get the right form now. So there's dry cupping, which is just the heating of the glass, and it puts on the skin, and then there's wet cupping, which is hijama, or what they call bloodletting. Now, trying to understand why it's happening is really important. So what's the reason? Because there's child protection procedures doesn't actually really cover cupping at all. So it's a judgment that we all need to make as professionals. Why is it actually really happening? And is this practice in itself harmful towards that child? What's the injury or the harm that's being caused to that child by administering it? So with hijama or bloodletting or wet cupping, across the board, cutting a child's skin, and doing it for whatever reason, for me, I would say, especially with that judgment that happened in Yorkshire, as I said, that it will be considered to be a child protection concern. And I know that the police will be interested in exploring it, based on my previous discussions with them. But with the dry cupping, it's when Madonna did it, and was it Phelps, the swimmer? And then, other athletes do it around the Olympics as well. It became this big fad, and a lot of people were doing it. So I would want to understand it a bit more in detail, and how obviously the age of the child may make a difference as well. So all these things I would want to explore as part of that child protection discussion with colleagues.
Yeah, so it's 35. Thank you very much. We are running slightly behind schedule, but what I'm going to do is, if it's okay with everyone, I'm going to shorten the break slightly. So if we take a 10-minute comfort break, get a cup of tea, stretch our legs, facilities, etc. And if we can reconvene at 45, and then we can start with our next speaker, Dr. Richard Burek. Is that okay? So we'll see you here at 14:45. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you so much, Lethan. Okay, so it's 2:45. I hope everyone is back, refreshed, and ready for the second half of our session. And we have a lineup of 3 brilliant speakers this afternoon, after the break. So I would like to introduce Dr. Richard Burak. Many of you may already know Dr. Burak because he is a GP in Montford and Essex, and he's currently senior partner in the practice. He joined nearly 33 years ago. He's the named GP for children's safeguarding for Havering and Barking and Dagenham for the ICB, and is also the current treasurer and former chairman of the Primary Care Safeguarding Forum, which is a UK-based organisation committed to providing support, education and a voice for named GPs and equivalents from across the United Kingdom, and to promote and support quality for primary care safeguarding. He's currently the co-chair of NHS England's London network of named GP. He sits at the National Network of Named GPs chairs, and he was part of the steering group that was involved in putting together the guidance on managing remote and sensitive consultations published by NHSX. So the reason I asked, he's got many special interests actually around adolescents and adolescent health and special interest group. So the reason I asked Dr. Burak to come and speak to us today is, one, he's a GP. And two, he's a named GP for safeguarding in our patch and is very, very knowledgeable. So he's going to be looking at domestic abuse and primary care. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Richard Burak.
Wow, what an introduction, and thank you, Sabina. And that makes me feel a little bit more at ease, having witnessed and seen the fantastic performance of the two previous speakers, and Lethan putting me in a corner. I think how to follow Lethan, is a tough act, and I'm not really sure I'll be able to fulfill it. But my brief today is to try and give a little bit of a grassroots primary care perspective on domestic violence, and to give some kind of support and prompt for all my colleagues out there, out in primary care, clinical and non-clinical, as to what difference we can make, and to try and address some of the fears that I think we all have with regards to how dealing with issues like domestic violence, what impact that has on our time and emotional stability, really, in what is quite an emotionally labile state of affairs in primary care at the moment. So if we're talking about emotion, let's start with a bit of COVID. It obviously hasn't gone away, and we've been through unprecedented times in the last few years. But clearly domestic violence was around long before COVID, but the COVID pandemic expedited an acuity, I think, in domestic violence, both an awareness, but also an actual reality that people in vulnerable situations and households that were then actually locked down just created huge amounts of vulnerability, in addition to the fact that many of the services, including general practice, that would have offered a haven to some of the victims to be able to access were even perception wise, and if not in reality in some cases, completely sort of shut down for victims. They say that in the first 3 weeks of lockdown, there were about 16 domestic abuse homicides of women and children, which is double the average rate at that time, and the largest number of killings in a 3-week period for over a decade. There were exponentially large increases in calls to DVA helplines, web chat services, even calls to Respect helpline from perpetrators themselves. And the number of calls to Childline, for example, went off the scale as well. So the impact of COVID has had a far-reaching effect, and I guess it depends the way you look at it. You could see that in a kind of perverse way as a silver lining, because maybe it's raised the awareness even more so through the potential extra tragedy and adversity that COVID caused to those victims and sufferers of DVA. And for me personally, it was interesting because I was privileged to become the clinical lead for IRIS in Barking Dagenham. And the system went live, I think, in June 2020, which, as you know, was literally 2-3 months once the COVID pandemic had sort of become upon us, really officially, with lockdown back in March. So we ran an IRIS program completely virtually and in a very, very different way, but it gave an extra dimension to the teaching and the ability to support my colleagues in B&D, who I have to say were fantastic in their uptake. We didn't quite get 100%, but it was a really good uptake, and I absolutely 100% endorse any of you that have the opportunity to attend in Newham and Redbridge at the moment. Really sign yourselves up. You won't be disappointed. And somewhere in this presentation, I'm sure I'm going to give some kind of a not so subtle dig to our ICB strategic fund holders, that, you know, this leaves Havering, which is my main sort of offer of primary care services, is in Havering. We're the odd ones out at the moment because we don't have any kind of IRIS program going on, and I think it's a real area that needs to be, for want of a political term, a levelling up needs to occur. So let me move on to, well, why primary care? What is it about primary care that lends itself to providing domestic violence and abuse support? Because actually, certainly before IRIS came along, and even with IRIS there, you know, disclosures of victims coming into primary care, or even perpetrators coming into primary care to disclose for the first time, is not that common in primary care. Programs like IRIS, which are evidence-based, are certainly helping to address this, because they have demonstrated that primary care has both the tools and the resources, if given the various resources that IRIS can offer, to simple concepts that all primary care staff, clinicians and non-clinicians, can follow and utilise to actually support better identification and better signposting and support for victims of domestic violence and abuse. One of my common mantras is about, it's not rocket science, and DVA is not rocket science in the sense of what you need to do in primary care to make a difference. We're really asking for consideration of using established primary care skills, using your innate amazing ability to communicate with patients, which is the cornerstone of primary care for all of us, using that terminology we know, which is linked to safeguarding, which is your professional curiosity. I used to call it, before I got into safeguarding, just being downright nosy, because that's what attracted me to become a GP in the first place. I love asking questions, being nosy, finding out things about people, and in health it was great. When a patient trusts you and you're in a trusting position, they will often tell you anything and everything, you know, even if it seems quite left field what you're asking them. So using that in a safeguarding, safety fashion is really a special skill that we should be utilizing all the time. Okay, and it is literally life-saving. You know, any intervention, anyone that you can identify, anyone that you can I get a disclosure from, you could literally be saving their life. And the biggest challenge that certainly when I went through the IRIS program, and even my own personal thoughts before that, is that you start dealing with domestic violence and abuse, you're opening a Pandora's box, you know, and you're sitting there, you're 25 minutes behind on a Friday afternoon, and, you know, do you really want to start thinking and acting in a professionally curious way and asking some questions, because you're already behind, and this is going to just put you 2 hours behind? But actually, in all the role playing and the discussions we had, it was not as time consuming as you'd like to think. So primary care lends itself in so many ways to being a fabulous environment, and a very appropriate environment for disclosures and support to be offered to victims of domestic violence and abuse. the other way to look at this, and I have nicked this from an IRIS slide, but I think it's a really good example of vindicating the fact that domestic violence and abuse can and potentially should be looked at as a risk factor towards ill health. Okay, and this was a study done in Victoria, Australia, I think back in 2004, if I recall, where it looked at various risk factors that contribute to ill health. And what they found was that actually intimate partner violence as an individual risk factor in its own far outweighed some of those other risk factors that we commonly ask when we're building a picture of what's going on in someone's life, what is contributing to the fact that they're unwell and what have you. And what's interesting is if you look at all those others, illicit drugs, alcohol, etc., 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 blood pressure, tobacco, these are core things that we are asking or checking when we see patients. Sometimes we have to through QOF or whatever on an annual basis, but we're constantly checking pretty much all of those other aspects. But how many times do we sort of come in and start asking about intimate partner violence? But maybe this sort of gets us to think about this in a different way. Okay. What we do know, because it's an obvious parallel and association, is that there's a huge impact on an individual's mental health as a consequence of being a victim involved in domestic violence and abuse. And this is just a statistical confirmation of that these 4 particular areas that have a huge impact on one's individual mental health: alcohol abuse, having suicidal ideation or thoughts, post-traumatic stress, or just depression, the odds ratio shows that they're between just under 3 to nearly 7 times more likely to be present in someone that has experienced domestic violence and abuse. And how many consultations are we having a day, particularly with regards to our patients that come in depressed or have had suicidal thoughts, or they have admitted to drinking much more than they would normally do. So is domestic violence and abuse featuring in the back of our minds for this? Well, I would say initially that wasn't, certainly for me. Certainly IRIS has helped me to reevaluate that and maybe outside the box. And then, of course, there's the impact on children. There was a cross-sectional survey back in 2000 looking at Welsh adults, identifying domestic violence abuse as a childhood stress. As childhood stressor, which, as we know, is an ACE, an adverse childhood experience. And 16% had been exposed to domestic violence and abuse. And we know that there are other significant ACEs that we think about, including sexual abuse, physical abuse, verbal abuse, incarceration, parental separation, parents with mental illness, alcohol abuse, drug abuse. But again, before I attended IRIS, I wasn't necessarily thinking of domestic violence abuse as a specific ACE. Domestic violence is a factor in over half of the serious case reviews, or SCRs. They've now been renamed, and I apologise for the terminology. We're all coming to terms with this, but there is no longer serious case reviews going on. They're now called Child Safeguarding Practice Reviews, or CSPRs for short. But certainly when they were called serious case reviews up to about 6-7 months ago, it was quite astonishing that DVA was a factor in over half of them. And we know that exposure to DVA increases the risk of negative health outcomes across the lifespan of the child. So it's not just about when they're a child, but it's obviously going into adulthood and the difficulties and challenges that they may then incur. So primary care, the importance of general practice, general practitioners and their staff. So I've got here one role of primary care, and I'm just going to read it, is in safeguarding is to recognise when children, adults, families are struggling or potentially suffering abuse or neglect, to signpost to resources which can help, to refer to other agencies as available and appropriate, and support vulnerable patients where possible. It doesn't just start with primary care as the clinician, because as we know, our reception, our admin staff are so important in this, which is why, for example, the IRIS program really emphasises the need to have training for for the non-clinicians, for the admin staff as well. Okay, patients will pretty much speak with receptionists or triage staff often before they speak to a clinician, sometimes face to face, sometimes by phone. And it's important that all the staff, particularly with telephone and video contact, have an understanding of the effects of domestic abuse on their patient population and the current risks. So if I turn to a practical issue, and that's about, how are you going to identify or see if there is an issue of DVA that a person, young or otherwise, sitting in front of you is going to talk to you about. And I think there's lots of ways of addressing this, but the key is about asking the right questions. And there are so many questions that you could ask. Okay, and I've got here 3 slides showing what has been called, it's not me that's labeled, the indirect questions. There's also framing a question, and then there's just direct questions. So here are just 2, 4, 5 examples of indirect questions, and I've highlighted the 2 that I tend to use all the time now when I'm having a chat with my patients. How are things going at home, right? Or are you having any problems with your partner? That's not necessarily relating to violence or anything. It's just a very open, sort of not absolutely direct question. Then you can frame a question. You can sort of talk about domestic abuse and validate the fact that, as the highlighted question, which is my favorite one if I'm going to use it, it's because domestic abuse has so many effects on. I now ask, I don't normally say all, but I ask a lot of my patients about this, and it just then lays the pathway for you to then potentially consider asking a direct question, okay, which absolutely sort of gets to the point of it. And I think one thing I learned from training is that actually you don't need to pussyfoot around very much, and maybe you shouldn't. I know with some other things, even despite the sensitivity of domestic violence and abuse, other things we do tend to ask a lot of indirect questions and open questions to allow the patient to sort of get there themselves. I think the feeling is with domestic violence and abuse is another one of my mantras: you don't ask, you don't get. So you do consider asking. You might ask an odd indirect question or a frame, but really you want to get to the crux of it. And again, the 3 that I've used most commonly is that: are you afraid of your partner? Do you feel you're in danger? Okay, do you feel controlled or isolated? It's more about the coercive control rather than the violence. Or has anyone close to you ever threatened or hurt you? Okay, but there are lots of questions that you could ask. Obviously, if you get a response and that you get a disclosure in one way or the other, you then need to obviously consider what you do. And that's the advantage of IRIS, that you've got a very good network set up with the advocate educator and the associated organisations that you can refer to. But if you don't have IRIS, what we do have developed through our networks are social prescribers, care navigators, and they have good links to the local other agencies and other support organisations. Some of them are third party, third sector, and voluntary, and some have been commissioned locally, and every patch within the ICB has different commission services, so it's difficult to put them all together on a single slide or what have you. But absolutely use your in-house or your primary care network care navigation system, your ARRs. Some of you may have mental health practitioners for children or adults or both, absolutely use the resources that you've got. It isn't just down to you. It is an absolute team effort. Obviously, if MARAC needs to be considered, which is that's the multi-agency risk assessment conference. If you feel that there is a significant risk and you need to consider referral to MARAC. Obviously, part of this is to do a risk assessment. If there's life-threatening issues going on, then you are really thinking about police and 999 straight away. I've never come across that so far, but it is there and has to be an option if you are very concerned of threat of life. Now, what's there? The other thing, of course, is that most of the domestic violence and abuse that you're going to see is related to 16-year-olds and older and adults, and that's by the definitions we've already had. That's what we're dealing with. But please remember that the children, and often there are children in the household, the children will be affected. And if an adult disclosure of domestic violence and abuse has been made, and you're going to then start to provide support for the adults involved in that, if there are children involved, I think that you are really duty bound to consider a safeguarding referral sooner rather than later at the time, because you just don't know. Whatever assurances you're given that the child has never seen me beaten or has never seen the abuse, I think you are duty bound really to safeguard that child and get a referral done through a MARF to your local children's service. Because again, it's got here where a child has died, the serious case review, or the child safeguarding practice review as they're now called, have shown DVA to be present in over 2/3 of the cases. Huge amount. So it just remind to involve children's social care if there are children involved. Nothing may come of it other than you're actually ensuring that the network of support for that family, including the children, occurs and is activated. This is a little bit dry, I'm afraid, but this is a well recognised piece of work that I think the Royal College General Practitioners have published through the work from Jean Fader et al. Over in Oxford. And this is about keeping your records succinct but accurate, and there's 3 slides here. I'm going to go into major detail, but I think essentially it's important as the general practitioner, as the gatekeeper for notes, that you do document and you use appropriate read codes or SNOMED codes now to document in the patient's records. So this shows a victim stroke survivor discloses DVA. It says that, really at the moment, it's history of domestic abuse is the read code and an associated SNOMED code. That's what should really go in their record, and the sort of any more detail or context could be put into the free text. Okay. There's a lot now. We're all grappling with online access and online visibility, and just remember here that as soon as you start recording things like this, you really need to ensure that online visibility function hides this consultation, or that you block online visibility completely in case others, including potential perpetrators, can access the records on behalf of this particular patient. So it's really quite important you do that. Recording in children's notes. Again, the same kind of read code, history of domestic abuse, and again, same cautions when it comes to online visibility. Okay. And you can put again free text in as a context in the sort of free text non-codable area. And not to forget that perpetrators that are proven, or they have come in and self-disclosed and are seeking some support and help, again, you can also put history of domestic abuse and then put the nature of the abuse and the perpetrator status as free text. This is just a small snippet of useful contacts. I'm not going to dwell on this, but there are many others. And what I am going to move on to is the Primary Care Safeguarding Handbook. And if you are joining us from BHR or NEL, you will be familiar with this, because we have been fortunate enough to be producing a handbook for the last 6-7 years to our primary care safeguarding colleagues. And this year, it's a little bit late, but it is due hopefully next month. We have got the first North East London primary care safeguarding handbook that will be available to every one of the North East London ICB primary care practices to be able to access. And you can see it's quite a comprehensive book lit resource. It's got everything, hopefully, you need to have to support both training and support of all your staff, and as an aid memoir, and hopefully with the latest information and articles that have been Toronto referenced, and you've got key bits of titles such as safeguarding processes, record keeping, information sharing, a lot about that, making a referral. There's a bit about primary care virtual consultations, which has arisen following COVID, bits about safer recruitment, learning from serious case reviews. And I can just see there that I need to change that to child safeguarding practice reviews. And then you've got specific areas and situations. And you can see there under page 62 on the right there, there is a section on domestic violence and abuse, which I'll show you just about in a minute. There's some various appendices there that also show at the bottom there are contacts, which we are nearly, not quite complete yet, but there are contacts for each place. And again, I'll show you an example of that as a reference. So it should hopefully be a good comprehensive reference for all of you to be able to refer to. And then the last one, which is also work in progress, is a safeguarding level 3 training grid that will hopefully be populated and show all the training available across the North East London patch as we go along to for all of you maybe to access. So this is actually the domestic violence and abuse page, and next to it are the alternative questions you could ask, that's where I took the questions that you saw before from. And these are two examples of the contacts. This is Barking and Dagenham's contact sheet. It has all the named and designated contact numbers, both within the NEL, but also NELFT and BHRUT. It has Children's Social Care MASH in hours and out of hours, LADO numbers, CDOC coordinators, and some national numbers there as well. Okay, and that's just an example of, hopefully that will become more populated. That's showing today's conference. Now I can see I've got literally a minute left, and I had a case study, so I won't dwell on this, but essentially this is a real life 13-year-old young man in year 8 who came in with his mum because he'd become quite aggressive at school, anger issues, picking fights. He'd been suspended, and I think that prompted his mum to bring him in saying she wants a referral for anger management. He's been seen about 3 times in the last 2 months by different clinicians, and has been referred to CAMHS for behavioural issues, query does he have ADHD. And this has been going on for about 6 months since he'd returned to school after the COVID lockdown. Average student, does things most 13-year-olds, likes to game, play football, 1 younger sibling, lives with mum and her boyfriend, and her it's actually his half sister, who isn't the daughter of the boyfriend. And on direct questioning when we spoke, he wasn't really too responsive. So I actually, with permission, mum didn't have a problem, he didn't have a problem. We asked mum to leave, and we had a further 5-minute chat together. And I used these 2 questions in particular within the context of other things I spoke to him about, and just to establish a good rapport. I asked how things were at home, and has anything happened at home that made him feel scared or worried. The offshoot was that during lockdown in particular, there'd been lots of arguments. Mum and her boyfriend liked to drink, sometimes to excess. He found that all a bit crazy, and he has seen and witnessed domestic abuse against his mum from the boyfriend, and he actually was a victim himself and was walloped once when he was drunk. And I think that probably was the precipitant of his behaviour at school, and because he then got excluded, it prompted them to come to us to say something needs to be done. So we did something, and it was agreed that we would do a MARF referral to Children's Social Care because of the violence he had experienced. There was support and follow-up for mum, and she was signposted and navigated as well. I think the police were involved, although it wasn't for us to phone them. And we also supplied some extra support for him. He came twice in fortnightly to see how he was. key thing is that it took just over 13 minutes, that consultation. 5 minutes for a bit of an overview, 5 minutes on his own, and then another 3 minutes when they came back to actually have that final impact. So a little bit longer with the referrals and things, but it was 13 minutes face to face. So really my thoughts and reflections was that the worry about time pressure hasn't been proven, and I think we should be allowing ourselves a bit of time. Even though this did exceed the 10-minute standard appointment, it wasn't that much over. Please use your professional curiosity. Keep your safeguarding radar active. Use direct key questions. All right. Remember, you are providing a safe space. It will help disclosure. You don't ask, you don't get. Often you will ask and you won't get. I'm not saying this was luck. It was fortunate maybe. He may not have disclosed. Many things may have happened and he may not have done. But in this case, he did. And it's not rocket science, but it's something that's real. It's occurring. And what we experience, unfortunately, is likely to be a tip of a rather large iceberg out there. But we can chip away and do our bit. Ensure we share the information, do appropriate referrals, use our other resources, our AARs, our social prescribers, our care navigators, IRIS if we've got it. Use a local handbook that we're all going to get as well. And let's make a difference, because I'm really positive that we can. And I'm really sorry, Sabine, I'm 3 minutes over, but that's it.
No worries, Richard. Thank you very much. It's always insightful to hear Richard speak, because he is a fount of knowledge, especially in the safeguarding field. And what I would say is he made every contact count. All it takes is one trusted person who genuinely shows interest, wants to receive that answer. And I think we get that in training as well when we're doing our Ging, etc. So without further ado, let's go to the questions, because we have 2 more speakers after Richard. So I'm going to be quiet and go to the questions.
Okay, so thank you. So child safeguarding should be a much easier process rather than by practice login and password. Yeah. Should be available via LBN website like Adult Safeguarding Concern is. Yeah, I mean, I think the processes that we go through sometimes do feel a bit cumbersome, and I'm fully aware that obviously historically the lead for children's safeguarding has been children's social care, which I think we all recognise that the way that local authorities work and the way they manage things can be quite different to health. So I think we find that sometimes a bit of a challenge. So yes, there are things where we may have to create login.
I think we've just lost Richard.
Sorry,
have we got you back? Yes, we've got you back, Richard.
Sorry. Yeah, I think someone muted me. That's probably not a bad thing. So I was going to say that, yes, I think at times we all find sometimes the referral process or to follow a process can be rather cumbersome, particularly with children's safeguarding, because we're linking with the local authority, which is a different way of working and a different approach to health, as we know. But it is what it is. And I think without children's social care on board, it would be very difficult. And it's not for us to investigate or to take things forward. We really have to work in partnership. So anything that does make it easier is great. But we also do need to have some kind of secure way of ensuring that it isn't just anyone that can log on and fill a MARF in and send it off. And I'm aware, I'm aware that different areas do things differently. So it would, now we are sort of all one under North East London. It would be lovely to have some levelling up. And my hope is that we can all level up, so that whether you're working in Tower Hamlets or in Leafy Upminster, when something child safeguarding comes up, we can follow a very similar simple process. Whether it involves not logging in and using passwords, I'm not sure. There will need to be some security, but I do agree that there needs to be a standardization. How do surgeries block online visibility? Part of it depends on have you actually turned it on yet? But if you have turned it on and or you are about to turn it on, there are ways within the internal operations of your computer system, so I know about EMIS, there are ways to block visibility, and it's done in the background by administrators that know what they're doing. It's literally, I think, a tick box that you would go into the registration details, and you would literally tick the box to block it, so that you can block the visibility. And my understanding, I'm not a huge expert at this, my understanding is that you can block various bits and pieces. So a lot of the online access is about patients being able to use the NHS app or use the surgery app to order their prescriptions, for example, or for parents to organise or request prescriptions for their children. They need to get online access in proxy for that and that type of thing. But if you've got a safeguarding list, for example, and if you've got suspicions or you've had a disclosure of domestic violence and abuse, you presumably have created through read coding a list, and really you should ensure that those people on your vulnerable list, for want of a better terminology, you should make sure that you go in and get your administrators to block online visibility, because it could be that the perpetrator could access their notes and can see that maybe they're having consultations and having issues that you wouldn't want them to know about. Right, quite often patients whose first language is not English comes in with partners who translate and often adverse to using language line translation. Yes, what a great comment. And my feeling of this is, the simple answer is do not allow or do not entertain taking absolute granted what a partner will say or do to translate, and whether particularly if they are adverse to using language line, I think that might raise your suspicions even more. And I would say that it's one thing if they're coming in with a sore throat and blah blah blah, but if they're coming in with a mental health issue or they're not coping or you want to explore it more, I think that you would be very justified to actually say that I would like to organise, let's bring you back soon, and I would actually like to organise language line to support. It's as much to support me as it is to support you, because I may want to use medical terminology that a partner wouldn't necessarily know how to properly translate. So I would put it on your own deficiencies, but say that actually I want another consultation, but using language lines. No reason why you can't put your foot down a little bit, because it is definitely in the best interest of the patient to do that.
Perfect. I think the one thing I'd add to that, Richard, is also family members, because sometimes family members collude with perpetrators.
Yes.
Although domestic abuse is intimate partner violence in the large, there is familial violence as well. Yes. And with cost of living and people in extended households and people moving in with one another to manage things, it becomes ever more complex. So yes, be brave and ask for those consultations to be rehad. Thank you, Richard. Now we
sharing.
Thank you. So I'm going to move us on to Anna Waddington, who is a nurse, an outreach nurse. I believe she's a sister at the Royal London as well. I might be wrong, but I'm sure Anna will correct me if I'm wrong. She's the founder and director at Your Stance, and she was the RCN's Nurse of the Year in 2020. She's a very knowledgeable colleague who I would like to pass you on to now. So thank you very much for agreeing to speak today, Anna. The floor is yours.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me. I must admit I feel a bit like an imposter syndrome here right now, presenting to doctors and everyone in primary care, because I've never actually worked in primary care, so forgive me, but I hope to give you the lens of serious youth violence through the lens of a nurse working in a trauma centre, and some food for thought. I think that's basically the aim of this talk today. So First of all, I'm not going to actually just use slides yet, because what I want to do is talk to you about a recent case that I had here at the Royal London Hospital. So I work as a critical care outreach nurse, but I've got lots of experience working in trauma, and I worked with the medical car of HEMS previously before. So I've seen young people who are, involved in violent activities through lots of different avenues. But this was when I was working in A&E. In the recess, we get a trauma call from a 15-year-old who's been significantly assaulted. We're not too sure if he's been stabbed, but that's basically all we get. And upon arrival, we get a 15-year-old boy. His name is Ahmed. Name has been changed for the case study, and he's been significantly assaulted with multiple stab wounds. One of which will probably need surgical intervention, likely will need to have his spleen removed. But thinking about this particular case, the reason why I'm presenting it to you is because actually the bit that impacted me the most is the amount of time that it took for me to try and de-escalate Ahmed's anxieties around just a healthcare professional touching him. And of course, we can think it's a response, it's a natural traumatic response because he's been through something significant, but it was more than that. He was scared of us. He was scared of me as a nurse, of the doctor. He didn't trust us. And that shocked me because in my eyes, everyone should feel like health is a safe space. And so where have we let this young person down in his health journey? And this is what I want to talk to you all about. So the first thing I want you to do is actually, if you could just sign on to Menti. If everyone's got access to Menti, if you go on to www.menti.com, I'm just trying to share my screen, and you can use the QR code if you're at your laptop. Is everyone logging onto that? Perfect. And my question is, I want to hear from your perspective, what is serious youth violence? Any word that comes to mind that describes serious youth violence. If you just go on to Menti and write this code, you should be able to enter. There we go. So we've got, yeah, brilliant. It's amazing. I find this actually quite interesting to see. So from what I can see here, there's a lot of mention of stabbings, a lot of mention of gang violence. But what I really am grateful that you are mentioning here is things like, exploitation, grooming, bullying, anxiety, mental illness, peer abuse, failure to thrive. This is great. So basically, you don't need me to talk to you, which is fantastic. Brilliant. So serious youth violence, from everything that you've already mentioned, is a number of things, but it's a term that actually I don't feel very comfortable using personally, because what it's doing is it's attributing the blame on the young person, and actually it's not really a young person's fault if they are involved in what we term as serious youth violence. This is a social economical issue that is impacting young people and our communities. And the problem, you said it there, young people are dying on our streets as a result of a number of different factors. And we know that the age range is the most at risk age range is around 15 years of age. And we know that the underage of 25 rose about 24% in terms of those who had been murder victims in London. On top of that, what is the impact on our communities? We have a number of impacts happening in our community. They're all traumatized as a result of serious youth violence. And it through primary care. This is having a toll on families, on friends, on teachers, on different networks that are supporting young people who have died or have been impacted, by being significantly or seriously injured as a result of, knife crime. And on top of that, we've got the cost and the impact to healthcare, social care, primary care, and we could just keep going on and on and on. So it's a problem. Young people are turning to circumstances that are making them unsafe, but that is not their fault. We have a role here in health, and especially in primary care, to think of how we can engage young people who are involved in these circumstances, but not just the young people, those around them, their communities, their friends, their families, the parent that comes in. How can we be part of the puzzle that is part of the solution? Because I know that you won't be the only solution. There's massive issues in the government around funding youth services, but how can we be part of that puzzle? Something to think about when we think about Ahmed is that a big study that was done in America was around those who had attended trauma centers, the equivalent of trauma centers in LA and Chicago. And what they found was that a huge percentage of young people had Sorry, I'm having some problems with my IT. I didn't really want to talk about that before, but a huge percentage of young people who had attended the emergency department as a gunshot wound or has been stabbed had been to the emergency department 4 times before. And therefore, we were basically in America, we're missing a number of these cohorts of patients. And a big study actually here in the UK has been done in the trauma centre. You've got the QR code there if you want to read it yourself, about looking at, on top of that, the code reds. So code reds, for those of you who've not worked at the Royal London Hospital, is a title that we use to describe young people who've come in who need hemorrhage control. And they did a 10-year retrospective study looking at all the code reds. And what did they find? And this is to add to your knowledge of serious youth violence. They found that the age of young people being stabbed was getting younger. And actually, the average age of a young person dying from these wounds was about 15. And the majority of the wounds would be limb wounds, and therefore they would be responsive to effective, immediate civilian bleed control. And so why is that important? Well, for you guys in the primary care setting, it's important because young people are dying and we need to do something about it. Richard's already alluded to it as something very, very important to think about, is not just the fact that we have this social economic issue, a massive issue happening and impacting our society today, cost of living crisis, but also it's thinking about adverse childhood experiences and how that will put you at risk of being involved in something such as serious youth violence. I mean, we already talked about it, but actually, if you think about pediatrics, things that you guys probably don't want to think about too much, but if you think about pediatrics and the brain development of a child, if you have one or more of these adverse childhood experiences, it will have a huge impact on how your brain develops, how you respond to stress, how you form attachment relationships with friends, with individuals, who you decide to hang out with. And things to think about is, maltreatment, violence and coercion, adjustment. And when I say adjustment, they mean moving around a lot. Someone who has insecure housing situation, facing multiple prejudice, household and family adversity, inhumane treatment. I think this is a really important one because we're now having a lot of young people coming over as asylum seekers who may have had horrific experiences in their countries, and then they come over here and we're not recognizing that as an adverse childhood experience. Someone who has been tortured, that is going to have a huge impact on their well-being and their ability to form safe and trusting relationships. And then let's think about our young carers. That's a huge ace, having the adult responsibility, having to actually work and be the main breadwinner. We have a lot of young people who end up working, making some money on the streets because they actually have a single parent who is not earning very much, who's struggling a lot, and they want to help. We had a young person who started to self-harm because her business wasn't going well, and her business was going well. She was 13 years old, and she really shouldn't have had to set up her own business on Etsy, but she was doing it because she was worried about her parents and the fact that they weren't going to be able to pay the gas bills, because that's all they talked about over and over again. And then the last one I really want you guys to think about is bereavement and survivability. And this is in context, especially with COVID. We have, a community of young people who've lost someone during the pandemic, and that's not really being talked about. Yeah, as a society, we've had a lot of loss, but what impact is that having on that one individual, and what sort of decisions is that going to, reinforce? So let's go back to Ahmed and think about his case with everything that I've talked about in terms of what serious youth violence is. Yes, he'd come in as a stabbing. He was petrified of us, but actually, when I looked at his case and I looked back, he had attended the emergency department 4 times before. And he was 15, just turned 15 the week prior when he got stabbed. His first attendance at A&E was at the age of 12. He attended for panic attacks with his parent. His parent didn't speak very good English. And from what I can see from the notes, he was discharged with GP follow-up. Then he attended at the age of 13, punching injury to the wall, had punched the wall 20 times, attended with his mum. Again, doesn't look like there was a translator that was used, was discharged, no CAMS follow-up, no social services follow-up. Now, I know that there's been a lot of research around punch injuries and being seen as a form of self-harm, but I think this was, quite a while ago. And we've got better at it. But it's this opportunity to have been able to engage this young person. And then the third attendance was a 3 a.m. fall from bike, fracture of his arm. And he was again discharged home. Mom and dad came this time to A&E. They didn't come with him to A&E. They came with him, and he was discharged home to a place of safety with follow-up with fracture clinic. And then his 4th attendance is a stabbing. And for me, it feels like I sort of understand why he doesn't really trust us anymore, and he doesn't really want to talk to us anymore. I mean, the amount of times that he's attended in the emergency department and we haven't really met his needs was disappointing. And I know that I've been complicit in that because I was probably involved or have been in other cases that are very similar to that. And why am I mentioning this to you? So remember what I said to you in terms of the research that was conducted in America, and there's some research being conducted now at the Royal London Hospital with the St Giles Trust around recidivism and the amount of young people who probably, the number we have is probably too low. We're probably not even coding it correctly to see the amount of young people who've attended multiple times prior to a significant injury. But what this is telling you is that although you may think that you're not seeing serious youth violence in your clinical practice, and you may not be seeing young people, I suspect you are. You're just not recognizing it. So in terms of thinking about primary care, I really, really encourage you to try and identify and intervene early. We know that early interventions is successful when it comes to serious youth violence. And that could be that you're seeing a parent, you're seeing a sibling who's anxious about their sibling, and it's just thinking about how you can connect those dots and assess risk. The other thing is thinking about what your service is doing in order to support the families who have had a loss. I know that in primary care, there's lots of amazing bereavement services, there's lots of support out there. But what happens when a young person has died and they're under your catchment area, or a family member knows of a recent stabbing? Like, think about what things are out there and see what we could do better. And I'm really encouraging also joint working for prevention, having better communications with the school nurses, working with the exclusion schools, working with different services that are out there. An amazing resource for this is your violence reduction program for NHS London. The QR code is there. It's got lots of educational platforms that are for free that you can use. It's how to speak to a young person, how to engage young people, and different services that are out there that you could probably work with if you haven't already got them set up. And I know that there's lots of pockets of work happening across London in terms of violence reduction. You've got the Vanguard program, you've got social prescribing, and I know that we're doing a lot, but I still feel like when I think of someone like Ahmed, I know we can do better. Something I'm incredibly passionate about is how we communicate with young people. Now, I used all of my skills toolkit to engage Ahmed, and I really encourage you to think about the environment that you have in order for young people to feel safe. There's nothing more important than making a young person feel safe. Why? Because that could be the first interaction that they're having with healthcare, and it should be a positive one. And that young person will be using healthcare throughout their entire life. So we want them to feel safe. And in order to do that, we need to ensure that we're being trusting and we're being honest in the way that we discuss things with them. I really, really encourage, as Richard said, try and speak to a young person on their own. If you're with them, always present it as a fact. We're going to have a conversation on our own. Your mum can step outside, your dad can step outside, whoever's with you can step outside, and just present it as a fact. And I'm sure lots of you have heard, but the new practice is to use the HEADS assessment tool. This has saved me in understanding a young person as a whole, where you talk to them about their home life, education, the types of activities they're in. And actually, I really, really encourage you to think about the activity side, because what it did for me was it allowed me to find what that protective factor was for one individual. That it might not come up in the social history, but for me, one of the young people who I knew was so horrifically unsafe, his protective factor was his football coach, the person who he saw every single Friday, who would support him, who he felt safe to escalate things to. And then obviously your other things, such as your drug, your smoking, your alcohol, their sex. And I encourage you to talk about, the sex that they identify as, and so that they feel safe in being able to disclose something like that if they're having any challenges. Their types of relationships, do they have safe relationships? Of course, if you think about Richard's talk around domestic violence, that's really, really pertinent. And then self-harm and self-image is just such a big issue now in young people, especially with social media and with the pandemic. It is escalating, and every single day in my emergency department we have 2 to 3 young people who are coming in with suicidal ideation or some form of self-harm, and that includes punching injuries. And then lastly, obviously, it's thinking about safety. these are some really great courses that I recommend you take part in. Obviously, it looks like I'm here as a promoter of Don't Forget the Bubbles, but I'm not, I promise. It is a pediatric platform for free. It's completely for free and it's amazing online. The courses aren't for free, but if you feel uncomfortable with assessing and looking after adolescents, then I really recommend the adolescent course. And then the primary care course has got a great talk on sex and talking about sex. And lastly, We Can Talk is an amazing free mental health tool that encourages primary care on how to speak to young people who are in mental health crisis. Lastly, there's lots of organizations out there that I recommend, and I know that Junior is going to come and speak to you about St. Giles, but you've also got things like Red Thread, Power the Fight, and Oasis, all of who are aimed at supporting young people, and you can refer directly to them. And if you want to help me save lives in the community, I'm always looking for volunteer medical professionals to teach bleed control in the community. We teach in prisons and the streets, and you can use it for CPD and revalidation. And that's it.
Thank you, Anna. You didn't need to have imposter syndrome at all. So knowledgeable. Paul McCann from NHS England signposted me to Anna, and he said she is a wealth of knowledge, and that she is. So thank you very much. Let's go to the questions and see what we have in store for you, Anna. Just give it a few minutes. But I think there's one thing that's really reflective to me. It's how we tie up our discharge summaries that come from the ED in primary care and how we code, and how we're proactive in our approach. And it's very precious. Each of our areas, I don't think there is an area in health or social care that is not pressured, but we're all working towards the same goal. So it's some of the smart measures we can put in place to, when we're scanning the notes, when we're coding, to then have that professional curiosity and say, hey, is there an early intervention I can do here? So I see a question already up on the screen, so I'm going to let you see if you can tackle that one.
I think for CAMS, I really appreciate the fact that their waiting list is so huge. And actually, I struggled as well when I worked in trauma to refer young people who had been victims of violence, because I knew that they were going to develop symptoms of PTSD or even anxiety or anything, but they weren't there yet. So I needed them almost to be sicker before they could be accepted. So I recognize that. But I guess it's maybe thinking about, is CAMS the right service for them? Because it might not be yet. So although a young person, is presenting with multiple fractures, what's CAMS going to help them with? If you're talking about anxiety, there's a lot of other organizations that you could potentially refer to. And St. Giles and St. Giles Trust an incredible youth practitioner-led service where they can support young people in finding the right service for them if the reason why they have fractures is because they've been involved in situations.
Yeah, and we do have St. Giles. Is it St. Giles? It is St. Giles in the Royal London, or is it Red Thread? I always get confused which one. Yeah. It's St. Giles. And are you able to tell us a bit about what happens after a near fatal incident comes in and the work that takes place? Yeah. Because I agree, we do have over 100 discharge summaries a day, and if not more. And again, that's where I allude to how all of our systems are pressured, and how do we find smart, manageable ways within our workplaces. There is no right answer. It's just trying to make things work for us. But yes, I'll pass you on. I'll let you speak to that, Anna, about the work that St. Giles do.
And I think if the only thing you take away from this talk is that I just want you to be a little bit more compassionate towards the young person and recognize that they're an individual. And the story of Ahmed was more about how scared he was of me and how I'd failed him. Healthcare had failed him in making him feel safe. So if there's anything that you guys do amazingly well, it is making people feel safe. And I'm just asking you to extend it and be more aware of the risks and why a young person would not trust you. But in terms of the St. Giles work, they're incredible. So really, really smart man called Martin Griffiths, who's the clinical director for Violence Reduction Programme London and a trauma surgeon here, basically went to Chicago and listened to the amazing work that they were doing around engaging young people who are involved in violence, and realized that actually he wasn't the right person to engage them. And maybe the nurse and the doctor weren't the right people to engage. And in fact, what he needed to do was to partner up with an organization that had that lived experience or understood a young person's experience in violence, because I don't know what it's like to be so desperate and so worried about your safety that you feel like you need to carry a knife. And I don't know what it's like to have to go and travel through county lines to go and work in a trap house where you're not sleeping for 24 hours a day and you're dealing drugs and you're getting paid less than 50p an hour. You know, I don't know what that's like. And so he partnered up with an organization called St. Giles. Junior is going to be coming up in a minute, so he'll talk to you about it better. But essentially, St. Giles trusts are a mixture between very, very experienced youth practitioners and those with lived experience. And they work here in the trauma ward. And as soon as someone's admitted with a violent injury under the ages of 25, they will be seen by a trauma practitioner from St. Giles. And they will be their advocates. They will assess whether they're safe to go home. They will help them make, good decisions. We also know that young people who have been involved in violent incidences will more likely have speech and language needs. And so that is something that St. Giles really recognize and really understand, and they know how to support them, how to advocate for them, and they really fight their corner. Sometimes you'll have a young person who's been stabbed 20 times outside his school and he'll be sent back to the school, and you think, well, that doesn't seem safe, but St. Giles are there to advocate for them. Or moving them out of a borough, that sounds like a great idea. Yeah, let's just move them out of the borough, but actually you're relocating them away from their only support network. What do you think is going to happen to that young person? So that's what St. Giles Trust do, and they support them out in the community and they carry on that caseload out and about. We also have navigators in ED who work in Tower Hamlets, and they deal more with substance misuse, and they're now starting to support young people. So there is there, but again, just like you, capacity is an issue. Everyone is drowning because although you want to refer them on, they also can't take it. So yeah, hopefully that answered your question.
Yep, that's it. Thank you so much. There's something about statistics, and I know you mentioned speech and language. I'm not sure if you've got any stats to offer, maybe not. I know stats are hard to offer sometimes.
Yeah, it's so hard. So there was a piece of work that was released recently on young offending institutions, so Feltham and I think the other one's called Medway, and they found that 80% of those who were inmates, or should I say residents, I think they call them now, for violent injuries had a speech and language need, which is huge, right? That's massive. But now, so from that, the speech and language team here at the Royal London Hospital are now starting to capture that information, because it's actually a really easy thing to do. The asset tool, which is a speech and language tool, it's really easy, really quick. It's just a checkbox, and it would highlight like the red flags of speech and language needs. And do you know, identifying someone's speech and language needs will probably help them a lot, because it is in everything that we do, right? Communication is key. We need to be able to formulate a conversation and recognize people's cues, understand what people are saying. And if you have someone in your primary care setting who's got unidentified speech and language need, then they might not understand what you're saying, and therefore they just won't say anything, or they've just learned to mask their speech and language need, and they come across as rude or difficult or challenging or disengaged. But actually what it is that they don't really get what you're talking about. So there's a lot of work around that, and I can share the papers that have come out around speech and language, because I think it's an area that we all need to think about.
Yeah, thank you. And statistics, no, not that was statistics. TikTok, YouTube channels. Do you have any recommendations? I know of Anik. At our last conference, we had Jim Gamble, who I think he's still the chair of the Children's Safeguarding board in City and Hackney. So the link that he offers is a great resource for parents, adults, even young people, and that can be found on YouTube, and I can put in that link there. I'm not sure if you've got anything, Hannah.
Yeah, I've got loads of stuff. I can send it to, and then maybe you could pass it on. But a really great podcast, I don't know if anyone's interested in podcasts, but a really good one is called Bird, which is about young people's voices from inside prison. And there's an amazing one around grooming. I really, really recommend it. They're 20 minutes, so you could listen to it on the way to work. And there's a great TED talk about adverse childhood experiences, which I will send as well. It's done by a GP in California. She was one of the founders of Adverse Childhood Experiences in the form of using it as a risk assessment tool in California. And I really recommend it. And there's a few other, I can't think of it now, but I'll send them on.
Brilliant. And there's one last, I might have followed it up, but how can a referral be made by St Giles via a GP? And what about follow-up? Who follows up the patient or the person, the young person? I'm not sure about the St Giles referral.
I don't know. You can refer to them online. So there's a referral portal that you can use online. But also I think a safeguarding referral should trigger a St Giles referral too. They should be able to let them know. I don't know who follows up the patient. Oh, I think perhaps you mean by follow up the patient. St Giles will allocate a caseworker depending on the risk of the young person. They'll never leave a young person unmet. It'll just depend what they can deliver. So they are national, but obviously they're not everywhere. And like there are pockets of London where they're not there. You know, you've got a different organisation there, so they'll probably signpost to them or let them know.
Yeah. And I think there's a question that's come in: if a patient refuses to be referred for abuse, do we record it in the patient's consultation? I think one thing we've got to remember with children and young people, there is no consent. So, and a child is anyone before their 18th birthday. Now, I think the other thing is about consent. It is best practice because then you've got that person on board, but it is not a barrier for information sharing if the risk outweighs the benefit. And I think if we're thinking about how the risk, and in a lot of the instances that Anna works in, that myself, that a lot of us work in, the after action reviews, the serious case reviews, the child death reviews, the domestic homicide reviews. And yes, I saw a comment about GPs always being asked. And I think it's tough because I always say GP is a bit like mum and dad. Doesn't matter how old you are, you always go back to mum and dad in most cases. And we are the centralized people, but we can share it. It doesn't mean we have to carry it. And I always say, talk to us. If you're anxious about something, talk to us. And we can work. We're not going to get it right straight away, probably in every case, but we may be able to improve how we build our systems strategically so we can operationalize them, and we can have better outcomes, because at the end of the day it's all public health work, it's all preventative actions and steps we're taking, so then we don't have to be firefighting at the end. But in systems that are already pressured, it feels quite exhausting.
And you know, it's just about the fact that until we can prove that the need is there, although we all know the need is there, we won't get more services. You know, St Giles team won't be funded. So we need to prove that you need that connection, that those networks need to be joined together. And although youth violence is not a new thing, you know, we've had gangs and violence within young people for 200 years, but it's a thing that's now a problem because everyone is, and that's why it's important that we have these moments where we talk about them and we try and problem solve. But I also appreciate that you're all doing an amazing job, and this was just a food for thought talk.
It was brilliant. Thank you so much for your time, Anna, and for coming today and providing your expertise. And thank you for setting up your stance. I hope we get some reach outs to you for the training, and for joining the team. So now for our last and final speaker, I would like to introduce Junior Smart. He's the founder of the St Giles SOS project and former offender, has today had his work helping and campaigning on behalf of vulnerable young people exploited through criminal gangs recognised, and he was recognised in the Queen's New Year's Honours List through being awarded an OBE. And he was his initial pilot project helping young people in Southwark. Junior was a sole caseworker. I could go on speaking about Junior. I've listened to his TED talk. I've met Junior. I've spoken to Junior. He's such a wonderful person, and he's doing such wonderful work, much like all our colleagues who have spoken today, and all the delegates on the call as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Junior Smart. I think, are you on mute, Junior?
There we go.
There we go.
Sorry.
No worries.
I was just saying, into the abyss actually, while my microphone was on mute, how amazing it was to hear Anna speak. And having seen her come in and deliver stuff myself, I have to say you really are missing out if you do not book her up for training ASAP. What an incredible project she's doing, and what an incredible cause, and how many lives are being saved by the work that she's doing. You know what's really amazing? Like, so many people to hear someone say that about me, and to know that not too long ago that actually wasn't the case, and that, you know what, my mum used to say that mountains, as big as they are, they disappear underfoot, one step at a time, and that is basically how I'd go about describing my transformation and change. If I thought that I was going to be in the situation that I'm in now, with an OBE and having a project, I mean, we was doing the stats the other day, and I think we actually stopped counting when I crossed the 15,000 mark in terms of young people I'd worked with. And so, like, yeah, if I'd set out with that in my intention, I'd probably have failed. But it's because it was literally, as the project started, I was like, okay, if I can just save one person from going through what I did, then that time I've spent away will be a success. Okay, so who's got the slides? Have you got the slides over your end? Should we get it rolling?
We do. Junior, did you want the video played or straight into the slides?
I'll tell you what, if you can do check out the video, let's go straight into the slides though. Is that okay? I'm just mindful of time. I've become a parent, and I've had some last minute childcare situations, so please forgive me. I'm gonna have to get a bit more straight to the point for today. So yeah, as Anna talked about, in terms of St Charles Trust, it's an amazing organisation. It's celebrating its 61st anniversary this year. It's been spent, you know, those last years were continually, since it started, it's been working with society's most vulnerable. Next slide, please. So St Giles Trust is a charity. The backbone of St Giles's work is, in fact, the peer advisor model. So what does St Giles do? What is the peer advisor model? We believe that people with lived experience, and I don't just mean people, because I know that lived experience is a bandied around term for people with criminal convictions, but it's actually lived experience means experience by their negative, so either contact with the criminal justice system, relationships, domestic violence, drug addiction, all sorts. We believe that they're the ones that are best placed to provide support, but we don't just sort of take people with that kind of experience and put them out to work. We give them an opportunity to get a qualification. So typically someone will volunteer with us. 8 months is around the average, and then they'll get the opportunity to go for the qualification. And then it's a proper qualification. It's a level 3 in advice and guidance. And these are people that are usually got negative experiences of education, negative experiences of authority. So it's quite a challenge. And once that happens and they get that qualification, especially for SOS, we promote from within. And we've only ever had to start advertising jobs over the last 5 years. So that goes to show the kind of the conveyor belt, if you want to imagine that. We do work in prisons. We developed SOS gang service back in 2006 and county lines service. Actually, we started talking about county lines way before everybody else. It was in 2014, which was 2 years after the Olympics. We started to see children going missing and then arrested in rural areas outside of their location. And the backbone of what we do next to peer advisor work is actually to innovate new services. So with SOS, and we had SOS Plus that we created back in 2008, which was off of the massive rise that we had that year in serious youth violence. Numbers that I would say are small in comparison to today's figures. I'm sure you're aware, you know, we've had machete attacks over last weekend. We've had the numerous set of attacks. Shootings are now starting, sadly, to become a commonplace within our landscape. And at the same time, money is being pulled away from services across the board. Next slide, please. So this map represents where our youth services are. We've expanded upon the safeguarding age range. I was quite surprised to hear that actually there's a safeguarding cliff edge still in existence, actually, and it's only marginally been extended from 18 to 21. However, SOS will continue to work with someone until the age of 25. And what that basically means is they will get one-to-one support from a caseworker with lived experience. And we will usually try and reach where they are. We are a charity, so it's worth noting that we don't exist in all areas. However, as we witnessed only a couple of days ago, when a parent contacted us, we'll certainly do as much as we can do to either get a service out there to them or to engage with the statutory services to sort of respectfully remind them that actually there's a case here that needs to be worked with. But the map shows where we're working. So we've got services up, even though we're a London-based charity, we've got services all over the country. And we're one of the services commissioned by MOPAC under Rescue and Response. So through Rescue and Response, we'll engage with any person that's caught up in a London-based county line. And typically, the thing that people say, like, what do caseworkers do? For us, it's that investment in time that makes that big difference. We'll invest hundreds of hours in terms of supporting those at risk. And, across the board, our average is around 200 to 400 hours. That's how much it takes to create that meaningful change. But the information's all there. Do please head over to St Giles Trust website and see what we do. If you were presented with a case, I would definitely head over to St Giles Trust, and there's no harm at all in contacting our main office to see what services can be provided. Next slide, please. So a big question I wanted to put out there to everybody is, what words spring to mind when you think of county lines? And I thought we could just do this the old-fashioned way, really, which is just to unmute yourself. I've never had that experience before where people, well, mind you, there could be quite a lot of you all speaking at the same time. But if a couple of you could put your hands up or whatever, it would be good to just get a little take, because I know county lines is this term that's bandied around, and I have got that lived experience myself. So it would be good to hear what your perceptions are. Exploitation, yeah, definitely.
Child trafficking.
Cuckooing, okay. Gang boundaries, okay, go for it. There's a couple of you got your hand up. Okay, I'm good. Is it Stephanie Abungo and Sabine? Sabina, you got your hand up as well. Go for it.
Mine is a false hand.
Yours is a false hand.
So shall we go to Gurmeet?
Go on, go for it.
So I imagine county lines as kids on bicycles on rural roads, transporting drugs.
Okay. All right. So this is quite interesting. So I just saw in the chat room, we've got, is it called Corcor or Caesar? He says it's a business model. And that's what I'd like everyone to start thinking about it differently. And because when you're on the other side of it, that's exactly what it is. And this is the problem. But this term, it gets bandied around. People think, I've heard it mystified so many times. Oh, this is a sophisticated business model. It's a perfect business model. No, it's not. It's absolutely not. They literally have failed their way to success. And have you realised that actually in our services, in the things that people work with, we are only working with the ones that actually aren't that good at what they're doing. So when we actually see it and we appreciate it for what it is, there's the exploitation angle is massive, but essentially it is a business, and it's a business that doesn't only deal with drugs. As like all business model, it evolves. So we're talking about drugs, but also human trafficking, sex trafficking, munitions trafficking, money trafficking, any illicit market these groups will take advantage of. And it's important to remember that county lines, although the rhetoric out there is it's traditionally seen as businesses going from, or illegal businesses going from city centres to rural towns. In fact, basically, it's franchise operations. That mobile number is the business. And when you think about it like that, well, then a business can operate locally. It doesn't matter whether a young person's travelling from the 12th floor in a block of flats down to the first floor in a block of flats, they can still be involved in a county line because they're involved in the actual business, which is concerned with illicit commodities. Does that make sense? I think it's really important because otherwise, if we mystify it, it almost becomes like unattainable. We can't deal with it. We can't address it. But the reality is there'll always be more of us than there is of them. And the reality is these young people will always present at some form of services at some period of time. So we'll always come across them. The reality is, what do we do when we come across them? How do we help them? And crucially, what are the next steps? Yeah. So someone said in the chat room, yes, it does involve weapons. Like I said, any form of illicit. And sometimes, you know, there's a couple of London boroughs, one borough that springs to mind that I can't mention, but it's the legal high capital of the UK. And that's legal highs. And anyone that's worked in a prison or been in that specific borough will know that the damage that legal highs cause on the road level, we called it guinea pig food. Because literally you're a guinea pig when you're taking it. And we want to see what results happen. Nobody really knows what you're taking when you're taking some of these illicit substances. So yeah, it's pretty powerful. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, let's just quickly go through this. So the county lines definition, I've put this there so that you're going to get it in your packs. Home Office defines it as a term used to describe gangs, organised criminal networks involved in illegal drugs. They talk about the deal line. They talk about exploitation of children and vulnerable adults to move the storage. But notice the focus is on drugs. And as I've said to you, these businesses, they will diversify their portfolio. They won't only deal in drugs. And when we talk about exploitation is a lot harder to spot than drug dealing. So it's going to be hidden in plain sight. Go for it. Next slide. There's another definition here. They're talking about the victim may have been criminally exploited even if the activity appears consensual. So there's a big confusion around the safeguarding partners. So we know that the legal age of consent is 16, but if that's still done under child criminal exploitation, then actually that is still rape for a girl until the ages of 21. And the reality is, I think the ages are too low, because in our field, we'll work with people with a lower maturation or age range than that they have. You know, so I've worked with a 21-year-old and she's got a maturation or age range of an 11-year-old. To take advantage of her is still taking advantage of an 11-year-old. It's because her understanding, her perceptions are different to everybody else. Next slide, please. And ironically, and this speaks a lot about the government, doesn't it? Like the best definition that we've got of modern day slavery actually comes from the NHS definition, where they talk about the recruitment, movement, harbouring or receiving of children, women or men through the use of force, coercion, abuse of vulnerability, deception and other means for the purpose of exploitation. Some people will be drawn into exploitation purely through limited availability of choice. So, you know, many families that I've worked with, they've had issues around getting credit, for example, issues around bringing money in. And what do they do when there's bills that need to be paid? I've heard loads of young people saying to me, I hear what you're saying, Jay, but my mum's crying every night over how she's gonna cover the rent. Like, while I'm doing this, I can put food on the table, I can take a bit of the worry and the stress away. And that will be a driving factor for many. I know the cost of living crisis has been brought up, but just be putting it in a real thing that some families are really struggling. And, you know, we're seeing families being made homeless at the rate of one family every 7 or 8 minutes in this country. Is absolutely astounding. Next slide, please. Okay, if we could go on just 2 slides, because I think we've already covered what county lines are. One more, that's it. Okay, stop. So everybody, let's see how clued up you are. So how many estimated county lines do you think are there in the UK? Do you think it's 296? Do you think it's 581? Or do you think it's 2,487? Can you type your answer in the chat box? I'll give you a minute. Excellent. So the vast majority of you at the moment are saying higher. Okay, not bad. That's not bad at all. Okay, excellent. All right. Do you want to know the answer? Okay, go on. forward one slide for us, is in fact 581. someone put 3,500. That's a very accurate number. No, and it's a lot higher. Okay, so this is a rhetoric. I appreciate what happens out there is people are talking about county lines all the time, and there seems to be in the media this fascination with how many county lines there are, as if the more county lines numbers there are, the more violence we'll expect to see. That's absolutely not how it works. So if we go down to Kent, Margate, for example, 4 square miles, and you have 8 different county lines coexisting, and that's because we have to think in a business setting. The market share is big enough for them to all coexist and all of them to work together. 1 square mile, 21 children's homes. So guess what? There's a big, massive recruitment in terms of the young people and in terms of the workforce. Again, thinking like a business setting. And in terms of estimating the number of county lines, which just came up as a question, the key thing here to check out is the County Lines Coordination Centre, also known as the CLIC. They produce reports every quarter. So definitely, and they will definitely engage with any statutory service. They're Home Office funded service. So County Lines Intelligence Hub or County Lines Coordination Centre. I can send out one of the latest reports to Sabina to share. Really important. So yeah, thank you very much there. There we go. So what they do is they map the number of young people. So here's the one thing that we've got to say as well, is that nobody actually knows the amount of county lines there are in the UK, because there's this massive intelligence gap and nobody actually knows how many young people are involved. But based on the intelligence, they estimate it to be about 581 county lines in operation at any one time. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what do you reckon is the earliest stage of recruitment into county lines or CCE? 7. Yeah, absolutely. Sadly, if you can move it on. For us as a service, it is 11 years of age. However, I am aware of other services recording lower numbers. The problem that we've got with the numbers that are involved is there seems to be this, and this is just my view, but I think there seems to be this sensationalism around young people violence, and when you see it in the news and the media, it just seems a bit like it's a chase to the bottom. It's a downward auction, so that people can be the ones that say the thing most shocking. When we went through our service, the youngest client was actually 11. That said, if we was to talk about where we could have put in an intervention, we could have probably put in an intervention into that young person's life before they were even born. Such is the negative cycle of what we're dealing with out there. Do you mind moving it forward for us, please? Okay, over to you. What do you reckon the biggest indicative factor of county lines activity is? Okay, wonderful, excellent. Some of you are fast typers. Excellent. It is, yep. Go for it. Intervention before that child is born. Yeah, no, powerful. Okay, move it forward for us, please. It is in fact missing children, and this information comes from Missing People, the charity that works with children that go missing. So I think the highest percentage from their last lot of reports were it was CCE, child criminal exploitation, was the highest. The second was mental health or emotional well-being problems, and the third was relationship breakdown. Can you move it forward for us, please? Okay, so this is rescue and responses data. And the first thing that usually happens when we put a map up is people go, right, okay, is there a county line where I live, or where my children live, or where my parents live? But the reality is, if I showed you a map of the UK, it's easier to work out the areas that don't have a county lines than the areas that do, because the reality is most of the areas have got county lines activity in them. And this league table that you can see down the centre, so people go automatically, like Hampshire's the worst, but that's not how it works. So these are the areas where we've received the most amount of clients from, but this is down to the services and their detection level and their ability to spot what's going on. So it could be that Hampshire's got quite a lot of county lines activity, but it could also be that they're much more on the ball and much more connected supported with services there. So when a kid is arrested from out of area, bearing in mind the key number one problem at the moment is no one wants to take responsibility for that young person. So Hampshire is quite clued up in terms of who to connect that young person with immediately. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that they've got the biggest county lines activity. It might just be that they're more clued up. But in any account, every single area has had a notable increase in terms of county lines activity, with the only notable decreases actually happening over COVID period. And we think that COVID changed the landscape. So rather than used to be a group coming in from, say, like, let's just say we're down in Plymouth, let's just say there was a London group coming down. What's more likely to happen now is they're more likely to recruit children that are local, so recruit children that are already there and then get them to do it in reverse. So you come in, you come back, you collect, and then you go back. Do you see what I mean? And so these are really, really important. Yeah. And like Sahih said, if there were arrests or violence, it would be bad for business. Absolutely. So rescue and response data as well is worth having a look at if you're interested. And that's through St Giles or MOPAC's website. Could you go forward a slide, please? Wonderful. Now, but let's get it thinking about where and what you're likely to see, because this stuff is hidden in plain sight. What we do know, for example, is that the drugs, I'm sure you know this already, the drugs are carried internally. So when we had we did some work down in Kent, at first we was doing work in the schools, and at first they were kind of like, what are you suddenly, we put some posters up in the toilets about anal tearing, and the head teachers are sort of like, wow, like, what are you doing? What are you talking about? Our kids don't need to know all that stuff. But then the safeguarding nurse noted a reported increase in the number of children coming to her and asking her questions about this stuff. And the reality is, I'm sure you know that, where you're plugging the drugs are corrosive surface, the drugs are corrosive by nature. They'll often tell the kids, you use Vaseline so that you can speed load, and then you'll have this situation, unfortunately, where the Vaseline erodes the condoms, and then when they try to retrieve the drugs out, the drugs break inside that anal passage. And so what happens next? And so all of these things are really important, because this will be presented through A&E, this will be presented through safeguarding nurses, this will be presented through school nurses. These will be people that will be coming to see you. It's important to know what's actually happening. It's also important to know that every time they get arrested, every time the police, for example, they're stopped and searched and the drugs are seized, or a parent finds the drugs, or even if they start taking the drugs themselves, like they start getting high on their own supply, that will create a drug debt. And that drug debt will be exercised through violence, coercion, threat. So that person may very well have to work 6 weeks for free, 6 to 8 weeks for free in order to pay off that debt. And in that time, sometimes it's not unheard of for the groups to set up the child themselves in order for that kid to create an even bigger debt. Now, all of this will be backed up with violence and threats. And so thinking about what you're likely to see, think about bruising, cutting, hypervigilance, depression, all of that sort of stuff, but as well as the stuff that people always talk about, our fancy trainers, fancy coats, additional mobile phones. There's also the stuff that can be there through being taken away. There's something about being exposed to violence that can really mess with someone's emotional well-being, and continually being under threat. And that's not the only thing as well, because they get these young kids to set up bank accounts. And again, if the money's seized through the bank accounts, that can create a debt as well. Okay, so somebody's asked, how successful are children who want to get out of this? Okay, so what I would say is it all depends on what that young person has done, whereabouts in the group they are, and the power of the help and support network. I can honestly say that for children, that the best part of this is prevention. The easiest thing to do is prevention. Once someone's gotten in trouble, either through a criminal record, in which case their life opportunities will be limited, or through drug debts, for example, anything more than £1,000 worth in terms of what they owe. That group is not just going to let that person go, because everybody would want to do what they've done. So what you have is the situation of, providing they haven't created a drug debt of real size, most of the times getting them out is relatively easy. But once they've created a debt, then it's a lot tougher. And, once a parent, and you'd understand it if their child's being threatened, once a parent starts paying for that debt, the debt may never get repaid. But once, that debt starts to be repaid, it can be even tougher still. I'm studying families that are involved in this stuff for my PhD. And yeah, there are some families that have ploughed in thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds to pay off a drug debt. But the reality is, if that young person is still involved, or there's that emotional connection, or even if the group are looking after that young person, if that group is, that kid's getting some sort of needs from that group, it can be really hard to get them out of the group. No. Okay, carry on, please. Right. So could you bring all the points up for us? Thank you. All right, so the reality is that gangs are recruiting at primary school age. Drugs use is exacerbated amongst young people. With that comes the increase in mental health issues. The normalisation and desensitisation of violence and sex for young people within their communities. We've all talked about the cost of living crisis and how that increases the appeal to criminal lifestyle choices. Social media has also had a massive, massive impact on young people's lives in terms of how they're groomed, how they're exploited, intimidation to the rest of the population. We know that repetitive, without intervention, the same groups occur again and again. And the reality is, young people are resistant to intervention. There's a real absence of trust, and with that comes the need for credible, trained people with that lived experience. If you could go to the next slide, please. Thanks. I just wanted to show you about this cycle of change. Okay, because I know that we typically talk about Procrasca and the Clemente cycle, but I wanted to show you that actually doesn't apply when we're talking about people that are exploited or groomed and exploited, because while they're groomed and re-groomed, they're not going to be interested. They're absolutely not going to be interested, and you'll get tokenistic responses, tokenistic gestures, but they're literally going to be like, no, I don't need you. What are you talking about? Like, if you use words like exploitation gangs, they're more likely to flip out and they're going to say like, no, that's nothing to do with me. But with that comes a serious, like we all know that it's only a matter of time before there's a serious event. And when that happens, that's when they're going to look around in their circumference in terms of help and support. And they will look around to see whatever support structures are there. So the key thing here is consistency. If support services are consistent, and I appreciate, like everyone's under pressure, and I'm not telling you to, but what your strongest asset to do is to build a strong repertoire of services that are around you, so that actually, and certainly a tip box of what makes services good, because you might have to be your own quality assurance in this arena. So when a young person presents something, if a young person confides in any of you, when you, for example, you visit that person who's got anal tearing because of like the drugs, where the drugs have been stored, you can have those kind of conversations, because you're in this unique space that separates you apart from the police, and sets you apart from other arenas where trust might have been broken. That gives you a real powerful curve in terms of what you can do. I know. Okay. All right. Sorry. Could you move it on, please? Okay. So we're just on the last stage there. I know. So sorry. All right. Well, should we leave it there? Is that, sorry, someone's saying that they have to go. Cool.
Sabina, I think you're on mute.
Sabina, sorry.
Sorry, it was Anna that was saying she had to go, and
okay,
thank you.
cool.
But I'm aware you're having a challenging day yourself.
No, I know.
Is that
I know.
all? So if you do want to cut it short, because we've had questions going through, please do indicate.
No, it's all right. My partner's just taking care of it. I think she's
Okay.
said. All right. So one thing I wanted to, because this is just the last thing I really wanted to sort of talk to you about. So in this case, Daniel is aged just 15. He was arrested for possession of Class A. He was arrested in the company of 2 other males. The oldest is 21, the youngest is 12. So Daniel is generally quite challenging. He refuses to say anything about who he is or where he's from. He shrugs, stares at officers, shouts an answer to any question, is generally uncooperative. Could you move it on for us? So what I wanted to ask is, what do you see? Do you see a victim? Do you see a perpetrator? Do you see a pawn? What do you see? Victim. All of them, to be honest. Potentially all 3. Okay. One thing leading to another. Okay. All right. All 3. Okay, could you move it forward for us? I wanted to show you. So the police themselves, they've got this wonderful professor called Betsy Stanko, and she did a thing called the victim perpetrator overlap. But in fact, that's been expanded. So we've got the victim, perpetrator and pawn overlap, but in fact there can be a 4th. So, and that's a witness. So he's a victim. He was attacked months ago. More recently, he was robbed for drugs he was carrying. He now has a debt. The group has threatened him in the past. They'll send him to work in grime conditions. It's terrible. He's a perpetrator. You know, he's been caught selling drugs. In the eyes of the law, that's a bad thing. But he owes a debt. So it's one thing in the eyes of the law, but it's another thing if that's backed up with violence. He's a pawn. We know that he's being used and exploited, but does he actually know that? But here's where the other thing comes in. Like, Daniel's seen the group attack other individuals from other groups, and he's also been there when drugs have been dropped off. He was also privy to a girl being raped. This girl was just 10 years of age. So if you bear that in mind, you see, every single interaction matters, because the answer to that offence, the answer to that, what he actually knows is actually of value to the services around him. But the only one thing that's going to cause that to come out will be trust. Do you see what I mean? So therefore, every interaction counts. Can you move it forward for us? Okay, so one of the questions, that's what we've got here, sorry, as well. Right. So the easiest thing we could do is jump to conclusions, go with stereotypes, go with group thinking, stick to surface level thinking. The worst thing we can do is actually to think that there is nothing we can do about it. Here's what we need to do all the time. And one of the things that I do as well all of the time is to humanize. Like, I hear what you're saying, but behind all of this is a human being. Repeat questions to the young person, repeat questions to the partnerships if you're sitting around the table. I tell you what as well, think outside of the box. There was a couple of times early on in my career where I was going to see people that had been stabbed and they're in hospital, and it wasn't until a bit later that I realised that they were framing their answers based upon who was in the room. It was a bit like domestic, and in fact, that's what led me to get into domestic violence work. Because when they're in the room and some of their friends are there, they may not necessarily. You've got to realise it's a hypermasculine, misogynistic, really weird space. So what's likely to happen is people are going to think, well, actually, I'm not saying anything, blah, blah, blah. You're a pagan. If I talk to you, I'll be seen as a grass, or they might be seen as weak. So actually ask and ask again. And also check that all the other partners are doing what they're supposed to do. Loads of times I've gone into meetings and it's turned out that actually NRM forms haven't been submitted, that the right adult hasn't been contacted. Build a repertoire of knowledge and organisations that can exist to show that, there are people that have come across this. Like, you need a repertoire of that. And remind everyone in this world that there are ways out. So there's a question there saying, what's your opinion about a GP being asked to give a character statement for a young person being prosecuted for something illegal? Okay, the weird thing about in this space is that legalities are quite tricky. I've been asked loads of times to be an expert witness, but because it can be the truth about it can also be misconstrued, and one time you could be on one side and the other side you can be on another. I think if you can evidence it, let's just say that kid's been presenting to you on a number of occasions, and they've had anal tearing, for example, you can evidence the truth as you see it. But I'd be very careful about getting caught into the legalities of it, because I've seen too many times one side can use it to their benefit. And, you know, I would not want to be in a case where I've helped somebody who was guilty get away with it, or helped somebody or said something and there's a lack of something I didn't say, that young person gets sent down. That's really bad. I think you have to use it on a case by case basis, and also base it on how well you know that young person, how strong is that relationship, because the problem that we have with the legal frameworks is so much money's been taken out of that space. People are in it for the wrong reasons. That's just, I've lost count the amount of times people have asked me to do it, and it's one space I won't go into, but that's a decision that you have, like a wise man told me once, you have to live by your own conscience and the rules that conscience creates. Okay, yeah, excellent, thank you. All right, next one. Okay, so that's me. There's my email. If you're interested, so I've actually got a website called smarttc.co.uk. I think I'm a consultant as well. I help people and families set up companies and organisations, but I'm a youth work practitioner and a youth activist. If you're interested in St Giles services in terms of SOS and county lines, you've got Evan Jones there, and the website is stgilestrust.org.uk. And the best place to get me at the moment is on Twitter or LinkedIn. I haven't paid for the blue tick, but yeah, that's me. Is there any last questions at all? Excellent. Wonderful.
I would like to say massive thank you, Junior. You've been brilliant. I've got to say a thank you to Sam Kessler as well, one of our designated nurses for adult safeguarding, because she said, when I was looking for speakers for this conference, she said, you must get Junior. And she said, have a look at his TED talk, and she sent it to me, and I said, I must have Junior, and I reached out to you. So thank you for joining us along this process. I'd like to thank the Training Hub, Joanna, Sedat, Shule, and all our colleagues across the North East London Training Hubs for supporting this event today, for disseminating there's a lot of work that goes into it, a lot of hard work, and they have to deal with my neurosis as well. So thank you to them. I would like to thank all our speakers for taking the time. Kenny, Joe, Lethan, Richard, Anna, and finally Junior. And I'd like to thank my colleagues within the safeguarding team, because they have supported me in putting this together. The one thing I will say is, remember this: safeguarding is not in isolation. It is a think family. And I think that theme has been reiterated all the way today. What's going on in the home will often affect what's going on with that young person or that adult. There doesn't always have to be children involved. And domestic abuse, it's not just about experiencing it. If we think about, we're all teachers to some degree here. We don't learn just by seeing. We learn by hearing, by feeling. And just because someone in the home hasn't experienced it physically or visually, it doesn't mean that they don't hear it or feel the tension in the home. And then that goes on to manifest in other behaviours. And the last thing I will say, Jane Monckton Smith, who is another brilliant person who's written a book as well. In the opening chapter of her book, she says, we often say as professionals, they didn't leave the situation. Why don't they leave the situation? We don't ask the question of what do they have to lose by leaving the situation? So it goes back to Junior's comment about humanizing things and finding context. So that is my last comment. I want to thank you all, because actually we've had an amazing turnout today and you've all stayed right until the end. So thank you very, very much. I will stay on for a little bit longer if anyone wants to debrief, have a chat, have been affected by anything. And the last thing I will say, last bit that I've remembered, a lot of these topics, they don't just affect others. Sometimes they affect us as professionals. And if you are affected by this as a professional, don't forget, as doctors, you can contact the Practitioner Health Programme, and they're anonymous. They will work with you. But there are also North East London community not community, staff support that you can access if you need to. You don't need to suffer this alone. So thank you very much to everyone, and thank you all for your engagement, and have a lovely evening. I'll just hang on. And please don't forget to do your feedback form so you can get your level 3 safeguarding certificates, the all important certificates. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabina. Well done.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sabina. Well done to you and the team for organizing. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sabina. Thank you, Sabina. And the team.
Great.
Thank you, everyone. It was really great.